Free Speech TV is supported by your contributions, and I strongly encourage you during the pledge drives, or even not during the pledge drives, to call Free Speech TV at 877-378-8669 and make a contribution, support Free Speech TV. But that said, our program, the Thom Hartmann Program, what you're watching right now, is sustained by commercial advertising, and we're on commercial stations around the country. We run ads. They pay us for that. And one of the ways that you can support our program is by going to thomhartmann.com, our website, and clicking on the advertisements on that page for our sponsors and buying their products, supporting their products, or letting them know that you care about their products and that you support our show. That's thomhartmann.com, and click on the advertising there to support our program. We really appreciate it. We really appreciate your supporting Free Speech TV by your ongoing, calling and supporting the fundraising drives, and we also would really appreciate if you go to thomhartmann.com. For our book club today, we're reading Out of the Wreckage, A New Politics for an Age of Crisis by George Monbiot. This is from Chapter 3, Don't Look Back. The political history of the second half of the 20th century could be summarized as the conflict between its two great narratives, neoliberalism and social democracy. Social democracy in this era, whose story I briefly summarized in Chapter 1, acquired much of its power and coherence from the thinking of one remarkable man. Across 4 decades, John Maynard Keynes's work dominated economic thought and practice. During the period the French called the Trente Glorieuses, 1945 to 1975, his prescriptions are widely credited with reviving economies and distributing their benefits. That they remain more or less the only mainstream alternative to neoliberalism today reveals a remarkable stagnation of both thought and ambition. The first and most obvious problem with an attempt to use Keynesian social democracy as a core political narrative is that the story is more than 80 years old. Political stories need to be renewed. If politics does not feel fresh, it struggles to kindle the imaginative excitement from which hope arises. The second problem is that the surviving enthusiasm for Keynes among mainstream parties is highly selective. It has been reduced in most cases to lowering interest rates when economies are sluggish and engaging in tepid counter-cyclical public spending, which means injecting public money into the economy when unemployment is high or recession threatens. Other Keynesian measures, such as raising taxes when an economy grows quickly to dampen the boom-bust cycle, the fixed exchange rate system, capital controls, and a self-balancing global banking system, an international clearing union, all of which Keynes saw as essential complements to these policies, have been discarded and forgotten. Not only does this ensure that the rich old story has been reduced to 2 thin chapters, whose loss of context destroys their narrative power, but the absence of other Keynesian measures, as well as changed global circumstances, weakens the effectiveness of the remaining elements of policy. Let me give you an example. In 2009, in the hope of boosting the economy in the wake of the financial crash, the British government spent £300 million on stimulating sales of new cars. Under its scrappage scheme, if car owners traded in their old vehicles for new ones, the government, with the help of manufacturers, knocked £2,000 off the price. This lavish program was partly justified as an environmental measure, though it was clear from the outset that it would lead to a rise in environmental impacts as the materials and energies used in manufacturing new cars outweigh any likely savings from better fuel economy. Its primary purpose was to boost British car assembly plants and protect the jobs of their workers. But European state aid rules forbade such schemes from discriminating between cars made in Britain and cars made abroad. British car parts assembled only some 15% of the vehicles sold in that country, which meant that 85% of the benefit went to car plants in Germany, Japan, and other manufacturing nations. We could see this spending as foreign aid to some of the world's richest nations. The current pattern of globalization, which developed partly as a result of abandoning the fixed exchange rates and capital controls that Keynes advocated, ensures that this problem is to some extent repeated wherever Keynesian stimulus spending is applied. It might lead to a general, if scarcely detectable, global economic uplift, but the domestic impact will necessarily be weaker than Keynes intended. This issue is compounded by the phenomena of job-free growth, caused in part by the automation now spreading into almost every economic sector. Today, governments pull the starter cord, spending public money and cutting interest rates, that ignited the economy and employment in the past, only to discover that it snaps before the motor fires. Two feeble measures, removed from the rich framework of thought and narrative in which they were once embedded, have little chance of sustaining a political revival. Another issue is that the troubles that beset the Keynesian model in the 1970s have not disappeared. While the oil embargo of '73 was the immediate trigger for the lethal combination of high inflation and high unemployment, called stagflation back then, that Keynesian policies were almost powerless to counteract. Problems with the system had been mounting for years. Falling productivity and rising costs push inflation, wages and prices pursuing each other upwards, were already beginning to erode support for Keynesian economics. Most importantly, perhaps, the program had buckled in response to the political demands of capital. Strong financial regulations and controls on the movement of money began to weaken in the 1950s as governments started to liberalize financial markets. Richard Nixon's decision in '71 to suspend the convertibility of dollars into gold destroyed the system of fixed exchange rates on which much of the success of Keynes's policies depended. The capital controls introduced to prevent financiers and speculators from sucking money out of balanced Keynesian economies collapsed. Today, it's hard to find a mainstream politician in Europe or the Anglophone nations, including those who call themselves Keynesians, prepared to call for their reintroduction. We cannot hope that the strategies deployed by global finance that helped to destroy the efficacy of Keynes's measures in the '70s will be unlearned. If the soft Keynesianism proposed by opponents of neoliberalism is to amount to anything but tinkering, it has to confront a wider set of challenges than most of its advocates have yet been prepared to acknowledge. But perhaps the biggest problem residual Keynesianism confronts in the 21st century is that when it does work, it collides headfirst with the environmental crisis. The book, Out of the Wreckage by George Monbiot.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Happy Tuesday to you. Brett Kavanaugh's lies continue to unravel. I'm going to get into that in a minute. But I wanted to start out with something that I think is really consequential and important. And frankly, it'll be nice to take a break for a few minutes from Trump and Kavanaugh and all this other craziness. Peter Zeihan, Z-E-I-H-A-N, has a new book out called The Absent Superpower. And old friend Jim Turr, who's just a brilliant musician, I'm not sure his website these days, but you can certainly easily check him out. It's Jim, T-E-R-R. And check out his music and all the cool stuff he does. He's got a very active YouTube site as well. Sent this to me this morning, and it was like, holy cow, what a forehead slap I got out of this. And so thank you, Jim, for that. And thank you, Peter, for writing this book. The key, I'm going to go someplace with this, and where I'm going to go, and I'll tell you in advance so you can be thinking about how this all fits, where I'm going to go is to the internet. It's a book essentially about infrastructure, and all I have are the excerpts that Jim sent me. Sean is going to try and track the book and the author down, get him on the program. But he does use the word infrastructure, but not in the way that I'm thinking of it. He's talking about how a country's geography, in fact, he explicitly says, a country's geography determines in large part what vulnerabilities it faces and what tools it holds. For example, he writes, countries with large tracts of flat land, think Poland or Russia, find building infrastructure easier and so become rich faster. But they also find themselves on the receiving end of invasions. This necessitates substantial standing armies, but the very act of attempting to gain a bit of security automatically triggers angst and paranoia in the neighbors. So, okay, you've got that, the impact of having large areas of flat land. Countries with navigable rivers, France and Argentina being premier examples, he writes, start the game with some infrastructure already baked in. That would be the river. Such ease of internal transport not only makes such countries socially unified, wealthy, and cosmopolitan, but also more than a touch self-important. They show a distressing habit of becoming overimpressed with themselves and so tend to overreach. Think France and Argentina. Island nations enjoy security from the United Kingdom and think of the United Kingdom and Japan, in part because of the physical separation from their rivals, but also because they have no choice but to develop navies that help keep others away from their shores. Armed with such tools, they find themselves actively meddling in the affairs of countries not just within an arm's reach, but half a world away, because they've got a navy now. In contrast, mountain countries, they're always the poorest one. Kyrgyzstan and Bolivia, for example, are so capital poor. In other words, they don't have rivers, they don't have, they're not islands, they don't have large tracts of flat land. They're so capital poor that they find even securing the basics are difficult, making them largely subject to the whims of their less mountainous neighbors. And there's this beautiful map of the Rhine Basin, and they talk about, and then they go on to point out, the Philippines, they've got this, their archipelagic nature gives it a physical standoff of islands without the Navy. Chile's population center is a single valley surrounded by mountains. It's so hard to get there over the mountains that, they kind of ignore the rest of South America. The Netherlands has a huge trade benefit because they control the mouth of the Rhine River. Uzbekistan is in the middle of a flat, arid pancake, and the lack of local competition adds a sharp, brutal aspect to their foreign policy. New Zealand is a temperate zone country with huge maritime frontage. And then they go to the United States. The United States has these flatlands. I think it has the flatlands of Australia with the climate and land quality of France, the riverine characteristics of Germany with the strategic exposure of New Zealand, and the island features of Japan, but with oceanic moats, the Atlantic and Pacific, and all on a scale that is quite literally continental. Such landscapes not only make the United States rich and secure beyond peer, but also enable the U.S. Navy to be so powerful that America dominates the globe. So, I'd never really realized that it's kind of a country, variation on DNA as destiny. If you're born competent in particular areas, if you're born very, very athletic, you have an edge in athletics. If you're born very, very smart, you have an edge in academics. If you're born, temperamentally or whatever it may be. I mean, there's all these other things as well that we've talked about many times. But for a country, geography is destiny, and it's kind of the same thing. It's the goodies, the tools, the gifts, or whatever the country is born with. But it ultimately, when you get right down to it, what we're talking about here is infrastructure. And it seems to me that the internet is the most important new infrastructure. It's the new river, right? It's a new way to transport things. You order things online and they show up at your house. It's the new fields, right? In countries that have large areas of farmable, arable land, you can go out and buy food from your neighbors. You can grow food. Well, here you can order food, right? It's widely available. I don't think I'm straining this metaphor too much, but if you think so, let me know. Give me a call on this. I think this is just a fascinating concept, and where now it ties back into Trump and the Republicans and the Democrats is that if the internet is the new infrastructure that is going to rival mountains and rivers and large tracts of rich farmland, if the internet is that new kind of fourth or fifth characteristic of a country that allows them to prosper, why then are we turning our internet here in the United States over to about 5 giant transnational corporations, Comcast, AT&T, Verizon, whatnot? Why are we protecting these companies with laws that forbid them? Well, actually don't forbid them from doing this, that allow them to prevent other internet service providers from offering internet over their copper. They own the copper infrastructure, but they don't, they have asserted that they own the data going through it. Now, in France and South Korea, in Japan, in most European countries, if, say, for example, Comcast, to use the example, I mean, I don't know that they're operating in those countries, but if they were operating in France and and you got your internet from Comcast, you could say, well, you know, I really don't like Comcast's internet service. Particularly, I don't like the fact that they're reading my emails and tracking everything I do. So I'm going to go with Acme Secure Internet Service. I'm going to have them as my internet service provider because they don't track me and they provide better security. Or they're faster, or they're cheaper. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways that internet service providers can compete and do compete, which is why typically, you know, high-speed internet, and I'm talking high speed, 100 MIPS up and down, high-speed internet in Europe is, you know, $20 to $50 a month, depending on where you live. Here in the United States, it's $50 to $100 a month. These companies are getting mind-bogglingly rich. I mean, Comcast made so much money in this business that they were able to buy NBC. I mean, just breathtakingly rich. AT&T buying CNN. I mean, it's wow. How'd you get all that money? Oh, because we're essentially allowing these monopolies. And if this is our new infrastructure, if these are our rivers and fields and plains, and if that's what this is, we are shooting ourselves in the foot hugely. Number one, by killing net neutrality, so that these companies not only can lock down, you know, can lock us into their internet services, which they could do before the death of net neutrality, but also by allowing them to extract from us all this information without our, enthusiastic consent anyway, and then sell that information or market that information or use that information to market things to us. You know, everybody understands that Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg became a hyper billionaire based on his ability to know everything about everybody so that advertisers could say, you know, I only want women between the ages of 25 and 35 who live in a house worth $70 to $150,000 in a suburban area in the state of Ohio, right? And they could say, okay, here you go. And pretty soon Comcast will be able to do the same thing, and all the other internet service providers here in the United States. And, you know, which is going to make them even richer. But what does it do to us as a country? It makes it harder for startups to get into the internet, particularly if you have to pay extra fees to have high-speed transmission. It makes all of us a little dumber. I mean, and then on top of that, you've got the algorithms. You know, Chris Hedges was here talking about this yesterday. The Google algorithm that has said that Alternet and Truthdig and these other progressive news sites will not be spidered. They're not going to track articles that show up on these sites. And so these sites' traffic is just collapsing. And when you're looking for good information that might have a progressive tilt to it, you won't find it on Google. And many of the other search services basically use Google as their front end. So you're not going to find it on them either, although there's really no consequential competition. So what does this mean for the United States? It seems to me that in the interests of monopoly and short-term profits, these companies are buying off legislators, particularly the Republican Party, but I'm sure that they own their own little portfolio of Democrats, or they wouldn't have been able to get away with this long. And these politicians, having sold out to these internet service providers, are now destroying, essentially, or they're locking up. I mean, it's as if, say, okay, one of the reasons Germany is so prosperous is because they have lots and lots of fertile farmland, and they've got the Rhine River running right through the middle of the country. Well, what if one company or 5 giant companies came along and said, we now own all the farmland and we now own the river, and anybody who does anything on either one has to do it through us? How would that, and say that had been done 300 years ago, how would that have crippled Germany? It would have devastated them. And yet that's what we're doing to the internet here in the United States. I find this just breathtaking. And the fact that there is no discussion about this in any of the corporate media, which by and large and increasingly are owned by internet service providing companies, makes this an even more dramatic disaster in my mind.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So, from there we'll get to Kavanaugh and Trump and all the other news of the day. There's certainly a pile of it. Stick around. And welcome back. Boy, there is a lot going on. Okay, let's pick up some phone calls here. Mike in Los Angeles, listening on KPFK. Hey, Mike, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Looking forward to seeing you on the 27th.
Well, thank you.
No problem.
I'm glad you're coming.
Yeah, just wanted to throw a little cold water on that hope that was raised on yesterday's show about Kavanaugh being prosecuted for attempted rape. Now, the right wing has been putting out a fictitious argument that since the statute of limitations had been eliminated, that Dr. Blasey Ford could have produced a prosecution. However, the fact is that the controlling law is what was in place at the time in 1982, right. And she would have had to file a complaint when she was 16 years old to avoid the statute of limitations. Yeah,
this is the, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe this is the result of the constitutional prohibition on ex post facto laws. In other words, if in 82 they changed the say the statute of limitations was 1 year, and somebody committed a crime in 81, and in 82 the government said, okay, and we're going to blow up the statute of limitations, no more statute of limitations. But 1 year later, when the statute of limitations would have run out, that person comes forward and says, okay, I had this crime committed against me, and the statute of limitations is gone. But the statute of limitations wasn't gone when the crime was committed. So
that's correct.
So you can't reach back.
And ex post facto was applied to the states under the 14th Amendment as individual rights started to be applied to the states after the Civil War.
Right. I've just been figuring that out in the last day or so, that because I've seen a couple of articles that point out that this whole Republican thing about, well, why didn't she come forward? Why isn't he prosecuted? Why doesn't she file a complaint in Maryland right now? She must not really have a credible allegation if she, and it turns out she can't, or she can. No, actually, she couldn't she?
Not and have it stick. I mean, he's sailing clear. After the 1 year from the date of the occurrence, the statute kicked in, and we couldn't retrospectively make it apply, because that's the principle of ex post facto. You can't go back in time and make something. Right.
Yeah, although it wasn't 1 year, whatever. I mean, I just pulled that out, but whatever the period of time was.
Yeah, that's what it was in 82, and in fact, attempted rape was only a misdemeanor.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, thanks for the insight, Mike. Do you see? I mean, I'm guessing you have some knowledge of the law. Do you see any? What about disbarring him? I mean, people are talking about he's violated the D.C. Bar's Code of Judicial Conduct.
Well, didn't they do that to President Clinton?
Yes, they did. They did disbar him for a year. You're right.
And I would think impeachment would be easily down the alley of possibilities.
Yeah.
But what impresses me about this whole business is the way that you ever heard of the Castilian dialect in Spain and how it got changed by a king's speech defect?
Yes, I have. In fact, I've talked about it on this show.
Yeah.
I think it's the same with the entire French language, by the way.
Same thing's happening with Trump and the gutter snipe approach to politics that's happening now when you have Lindsey Graham having the vapors and melting down, and it's like he's directing the thing, as I see it, and imposing his own standards on the civic discourse.
I agree. I think Trump is driving this, yes, and it's changing the nature of politics in America, not for the better. Thank you, Mike, for the call. It's great to hear from you. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. On the Brett Kavanaugh front, Michael Harriot is tweeting, I'm just here to remind you all that when a cop killed Brian Hundley, a jury found that the cop lied. This is Rebecca N. tweeted it originally. In this civil case, the family of a black dentist who was stopped in his car and shot by an off-duty policeman, that family sued the officer for damages. A jury found the officer lied when he claimed the dentist lunged at him and awarded the family $242,000. Brett Kavanaugh overturned that verdict. Right. And now we're finding I mean, just the multiple lies of Brett Kavanaugh. It's just breathtaking, the lies of Brett Kavanaugh. He testified before the United States Senate under oath that he learned of Deborah Ramirez's claims in September when the article was published by Vanity Fair, I believe it was, or in the New Yorker, when the New Yorker article came out. And now it turns out that back in July, Brett Kavanaugh was texting and talking with his old friends from Yale about Deborah Ramirez, and trying to basically line up their stories. There's an amazing piece over at Huffington Post today, right now, titled "All the Lies Brett Kavanaugh Told," and it goes through them. He, under oath, repeatedly, he said, Dr. Ford's allegation is not merely uncorroborated, it is refuted by the very people she says were there, including a longtime friend of hers. That's his actual exact testimony. But the reality is none of those people who were at the party, Mark Judge, Leland Kaiser, P.J. Smith, none of them ever refuted anything. They simply have all said, I don't remember. He says he was never at a gathering like the one that Blasey Ford described. But on his calendar on that very day, July 1st, so he gathered for brewskis with two of the three people Blasey said she remembers being there. Small gathering, beer, Judge, Brett, PJ, check, check, check. So he lied about that under oath. He lied about his knowledge of Christine Blasey Ford. He said we did not travel in the same social circles. Excuse me, he was going to this party with Squee on July 1st, 82, and Squee was dating Kavanaugh. Was dating Blasey Ford. He says, I did not drink beer to the point of blacking out. Well, his friend Dr. Liz Swisher says Brett was a sloppy drunk, and I know because I drank with him. He'd end up slurring his words, stumbling. Well, that's something that's commonly associated with blackout drinking. James, I think it's like the media or whatever. Some of these people don't understand what blackout drinking is. Blackout drinking doesn't mean you fall over unconscious, which is how Kavanaugh kept referring to it in the testimony. Blackout drinking means you stop remembering what happened, but you keep doing it, right? You're still having conversations with people. You're still doing things. And when you wake up the next morning, you have no recollection of having done it. And he talks about being a blackout drunk several times. He said another lie, the drinking age was 18 in Maryland. No, it was 21. He lied about the meaning of boof and Devil's Triangle. He lied about Renate alumnus. He lied about having no connections to Yale. In fact, he was a legacy student. His grandfather went there. He didn't get there by his working my tail off. 25% of the students at Yale are legacy students. They get in because one of their parents or grandparents went to Yale. He said, nobody accused me of sexual misconduct until last week. No, it was back in July. He said, Mark Judge's memoir was fictionalized. No. Judge says this book is based on actual experiences. And don't get me started on Judge Alex Kaczynski. Actually, I will start on it.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Right after the break, I'll wrap this up and we'll pick up your phone calls. Stick around. It's 27 minutes past the hour. Years of strategy and struggle against the prison industrial complex. It's a collection of essays. This one is by David Gilbert on page 31, titled The System Within the System, the Prison Industrial Complex and Imperialism. For those of us held behind locked gates within the walls and fences topped with razor wire, the corrections regime is the system that works tirelessly to impose total control over every aspect of our lives. Yet as ponderous and powerful as prisons are, they're only one part, a central girder, of a much bigger and more foreboding house of horrors, which can most accurately be named imperialism. The structural needs of the larger edifice set the specifications for the size and position of the girder. The strength of the girder helps determine how long the building itself will stand. We can't understand the explosion of imprisonment in the United States since 1971 without looking at an imperialism's urgent needs and goals of that period. By the same token, we can't develop an effective program around the prison industrial complex without grappling with the stresses and trends of the larger system of imperial rule. To be clear, before you take time to read this chapter, I don't offer any brilliant ideas on strategy. Those will most likely emerge from the organizing and activist efforts themselves. However, some of the concerns discussed may raise questions that go into forming strategy. I definitely look forward to learning from the dialogues that this generates on these issues. Imperialism may sound like the kind of rhetoric we want to avoid, but it's one word that needs to be rescued as the best way to name the system that rules over us. The basis of imperialism is the relentless quest for profits around the globe. Its most striking characteristic is the colossal and grotesque polarization of wealth. That polarization happens between nations, between the rich countries of the North and the impoverished ones of the global South, the impoverished countries of Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia, and at the same time within each country based on class, race, and gender. The poles of dazzling wealth and abject poverty are intimately linked, as the former results from the ruthless plunder of the latter. This system is built on and intensifies all the major forms of oppression: patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy, all of which are structurally central. At the same time, imperialism highlights the global character of the system in a way that explains why the most intense oppression and resistance have been in the South, and that also provides the context for why the liberation struggles of the various people of color have been in the forefront within the U.S. There's no way to capture what the system costs in human life and potential, the pain and loss for all of us. Close to 1 billion human beings suffer chronic hunger, while another 2 billion face nutritional deficiencies. 1 billion lack access to clean drinking water. Just looking at children under the age of 5, imperialism is a holocaust in progress. Over 9 million die every year from easily preventable causes associated with poverty. The price for future generations may be even more severe as the rapaciousness of this global frenzy for profits threatens the very ecological basis for sustaining human life on any scale on our planet. Since most people won't accept living in squalor amid plenty, imperialism entails both the most sophisticated and the most brutal forms of social control. Its most salient feature is war, war after war after war, mainly against the peoples of the South. The domestic front line of such repression is a truly violent and harmful prison industrial complex. Today, 2,300,000 people are held behind bars, about 7 times the number in 1971. That explosion was unprecedented, coming after a 70-year period when the rates of imprisonment had remained more or less constant. This dramatic change did not result from some sudden skyrocketing of criminal activity, but rather from a radical expansion of what was designated as a crime and a draconian increase in the punishments for those crimes. Such extreme measures were driven by considerations way beyond criminal justice and often at cross purposes to the proclaimed goal of public safety. These destructive changes were born from crisis, one much more severe and protracted than the periodic ups and downs of the business cycles that occur over a roughly 10-year period, but rather a situation that threatened the very survival of the system. Such structural crises occur because capitalism is by its nature unstable. The economy is vast and complicated, but the major decisions are made by a tiny corporate and financial elite, with each thinking only of his own profits. When a structural crisis develops, the long-term institutional arrangements that assured a reliable flow of profits and the rule of capital no longer function. One dramatic example was the Great Depression of the 1930s, followed by World War II. At the end of that period, a new set of international institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, were created. At the same time, a new deal was hammered out for the terms of the bargain between capital and labor within the U.S. Those arrangements worked well for capital until they broke down a generation later. That new structural crisis, which emerged between 1968 and 73, is the seedbed for the burgeoning of the prison industrial complex and many related changes in U.S. history. The first and most obvious signs were political, as the resistance to imperialism crested in 1968. Abolition now.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Just a reminder, Congressman Mark Pocan will be with us in about a half hour, taking your calls for the full hour. He is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And in our third hour today, Jack Bryan, the director and co-writer of this new documentary, it's called Active Measures, A Conspiracy Hiding in Plain Sight, about how the Russian government worked to swing our elections, or perhaps Russian oligarchs, or both. We'll find out when we talk to him. Is going to be with us. And Susan Walsh is going to be with us too. So, you know, we've got a full day and a lot of fascinating stuff. Just finishing up the Brett Kavanaugh lies. Judge Alex Kozinski was a mentor to Brett Kavanaugh. He clerked for him in 91 and 92. Kozinski was first accused of sadistic and abusive behavior toward women in 1985. Reports about his harassment of female clerks, this is before Kavanaugh started working for him. Reports of his harassment of female clerks and his maintenance of a website hosting porn came out in 2008. Kozinski was also known to send to a listserv wildly inappropriate content that demeaned women. He was admonished in 2009, stepped down as Chief Judge of the Ninth Circuit in 2014. And yet Kavanaugh appeared with him at a Federalist Society event in 2015 after he had stepped down because of his sexual misconduct. And of course, Kavanaugh lied about that. He lied about his involvement with the William Pryor nomination. He said, quote, "I was not involved in handling this nomination." Then we see an email where Kyle Sampson, a Justice Department staffer, says, "How'd the Pryor interview go? Call me." And, you know, other emails. He lied about his involvement with the Judge Charles Pickering Sr. nomination. He lied about his involvement with warrantless wiretapping in the Bush administration. In fact, John Yoo corresponded with him about this. He sent a letter to John Yoo, who was then the Office of Legal Counsel, saying, "Any results yet on the Fourth Amendment implications of random constant surveillance of phone and email conversations?" Really? In 2003, he got stolen documents from a mole inside the Senate staffers. I'm not sure who the guy was working for, and he passed the. No, I'm sorry. He was in the Bush White House. I don't know who the staffer was, but the staffer passed him this information. He lied about it, and he lied about Donald Trump. He said no president has conducted a more thorough examination in history. It was a lie, just a flat-out, blatant lie. So. Anyhow, a lot of thoughts and a lot of, well, we'll see what you have to say. Jesse in Miami. Hey, Jesse, what's on your mind?
Hey, hi, Tom. Wow, you say you was really mixing up the metaphors with the geography and technology.
Yeah.
I'd like to help you mix them up even more. Leadership and ownership.
Okay.
Going to the aristocracy that came over here to, give birth to this country, you figure a leader, the chief, whatever, they pretty much set the rules for society just by the position of being the leader of a crowd or whatever, first on top of a mountain or whatever.
Sure.
And everybody just say, okay, well, Tom was there first, well, Tom set the rules. And then Tom all of a sudden starts saying, well, this is my property, this is your property. So how things could get confused, and just to throw even more crazy metaphor into it, it's like a frog cooking slowly. These ideas been boiling for years. Yeah. You're absolutely right, Jesse. You're absolutely right. And, it's a great example, and it ties back to the old kings, the warlord kings who would conquer territories by virtue of strength or willingness to kill. And then, shape the character and nature of those territories for years and years. Well said. Thank you very much, Jesse. Verity in Chicago. Hey, Verity, what's up?
Yes, I wanted to talk to you about the Kavanaugh hearings. Mm-hmm. People say, well, the accusations are 36 years old. We don't have any evidence. That is not true. We do have the evidence of the living brain and body of Kavanaugh himself. And the principle is this. You don't get orange juice from apples. You get apple juice from apples. Parasitic and predatory brains produce parasitic and predatory behavior, and we have methods for detecting that now. For example, the polygraph. It does not detect lies. What it does is detect your bodily changes in response to a set stimulus. Your body's reactions to those stimulus tells whether or not you are reacting to the stimulus in one way or another.
Right.
Or, and even more importantly, not reacting. Just as a case in point, you remember the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski.
Mm-hmm.
He had a resting heart rate of 48 beats per minute. That is exceedingly low. Normal is between 60 and 7-ish. This physiological flag will tell you you're dealing with somebody who is capable of enormity. You're dealing with somebody who is capable of anempathetic, predatory behavior.
Well, no, the resting heartbeat rate does not, Verity. What it tells you is the strength of the heart muscle. Somebody.
It also,
I can tell you from personal experience. For 7 years, I climbed, for 6 years, when we lived in Washington, D.C., every single day of the week, I climbed 7 flights of, really about 8 flights of stairs, because the first floor was 2 floors. And by the time I got to the 7th floor, I was just flat out exhausted, out of breath, panting. When I started doing that, my resting heart rate was typically around 75 to 80.
75.
It is now, my resting heart rate now is between 59 and 62 as a result of 7 years of climbing stairs every day.
Yes, but it's not the only symptom. It's like a syndrome. The fever does not alone tell you.
Yeah. The thing that will tell you, Verity, is if Ted Kaczynski was hooked up to a polygraph, or to a lie detector machine, and they asked him a question, did you kill someone or did you send the bomb off? And he said no, and he didn't see a change in his heart rate.
Right.
That's an indication that either he's innocent or he's a sociopath. Exactly. And the challenge is separating those two. And I'm guessing that Brett Kavanaugh is probably not a sociopath, given how much emotion that we saw. And, I think he's a narcissist.
My dear Tom, I would like to direct you to study the dark triad, narcissism, psychopathy, Machiavellianism.
Yeah.
All of these are anempathetic, predatory diseases.
I agree.
And they can fake these things to manipulate people. This is the one skill that parasitic predators have, is manipulating other human beings in order to extract value.
Oh yeah, look at Donald Trump. I mean, okay, well said. I agree. Verity, thank you for kicking off that conversation. Kat, and the question, it raises an interesting question. Yeah, Trump, I believe, is all three. But is Kavanaugh a narcissist? Is he a sociopath? What's going on with him? Anyhow, Kathleen in Astoria, New York, watching us on Facebook Live. Hey, Kathleen, what's up?
Hi.
Hi.
I was listening to your conversation about telephones and all of that, and wondering what you think about the president having access to every single individual's telephone number to send out a warning broadcast, and why it would just be from him, that branch in particular.
Right.
And, our privacy concerns, if it gets hacked, a whole bunch of concerns came up.
Yeah, it concerns me. My main concern around this is who's controlling this. And I may be wrong on this. I want to fact check myself. So please don't, carve in stone what I'm saying here. But my understanding is that nationwide broadcast alert is coming out of the Department of Homeland Security. And the Department of Homeland Security is essentially a police agency. And, and Trump has branded it as it'll be my tweet to the world. But it's really a DHS tweet, I believe, or text message, I guess, that goes to everybody.
Right. Well, there were many people who criticized their alert system as sort of being manipulative.
Well, that's where I'm going with this is, because it's coming out of a police agency. Police agencies are intrinsically political. Police agencies are typically what are used by petty tin pot dictators to take over countries. Police agencies, and we see this right now in the United States. I would much rather the responsibility, if the goal is to have a national alert system to say, okay, we've had there was another 9/11, there's a terrorist incident going on, or there's 30 terrorists on the loose around the country, or there's a giant earthquake hitting California and it might start spreading around the country. It's hard to think of something that should go to everybody in the country, but those might qualify. I would rather see that coming out of an agency like NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, an agency that doesn't do politics, that doesn't have the power to imprison people, that doesn't essentially suck up to the president. It may be an executive branch office, but it's not it's one that's related to infrastructure rather than policing.
I have another question sort of about, communications and how we're having less sources.
Yeah.
I know that you used to be on the RT channel, and it's no longer broadcasting on any cable channels, and I was wondering if you had any input on that as to why they would stop broadcasting on Spectrum and many U.S. cable channels and what that does to alternate voices.
Yeah, as far as I know, and I haven't been paying super careful attention to this, but around the time that I left, there were a number of, the U.S. government was saying, well, this is, funded by the Kremlin. We're going to label this as state propaganda. And as a result of that, a number of the companies that were carrying RT started dropping them. Where that's at right now, I'm not really sure, but that's what's going on. Kathleen, thank you for the call. Randy in Ottawa, Iowa. Hey, Randy, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, how are you today?
Good. What's up?
Hey, your opening rant or your opening today, you were talking about the geological advantages of progress.
Yeah, or geographic.
Of progress and nation building.
Yep.
And this morning there was something that I'd like to add to that. There was on Morning Joe, there was a guy by the name of Michael Lewis, The Fifth Risk, a book that just came out.
I saw the tail end of that interview. It sounded fascinating.
It is. If you just, from what I saw in the interview, put that in with your opening, it would flesh out the state of affairs that we're in right now. And there's no account for bad leadership. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You can take a geographically advantaged country and give it a Hitler or a Mussolini or a Trump, not to mean anything, but you're going to end up in a crapper anyways.
Yeah, they're essentially exploiting the resources of the country.
Yep. Or they're just not managing them as they should.
Right. Well, or they're managing them on behalf of special interests rather than on behalf of the good of the people.
Amen.
I would say that's what's going on. Norway owns its own oil. We don't. We just give it to the Koch brothers. Thanks a lot, Randy, for the call. Good talking to you. We'll be right back. It's 46 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
What's in the news of the day right after this? And welcome back. Let's see here. Who's calling from where? Jesse in Sacramento, California. Watch this on Free Speech TV. Hey, Jesse, what's on your mind? Jesse? In Sacramento? Okay, I'm not hearing Jesse. Jesse, call us right back, okay? Actually, I'll put him on hold, him or her. That's Jesse's on line 6, Shira. If you can track that down. That's I think pretty much everybody else is calling on a commercial radio station, so which is not hearing our feed right now. So we'll pick them up after this. But back to Brett Kavanaugh. Well, actually, I want to go beyond Brett Kavanaugh. Let me do a little rant here about something that I think is, apropos of Randy's call from Iowa, where he was saying, what's the deal? And Robert Weissman, who's the president of Public Citizen, has just come up with a new crime report. He's talking about the FBI's crime report. And he says the whole tough on crime posture is just an act that Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions are doing. And he notes they're plenty cruel to vulnerable immigrant families. They're eager to throw the book at low-level nonviolent drug offenders. But when it comes to the rich and powerful, to corporate criminals and corporate wrongdoers, Trump and Sessions are full of empathy and eager to let them off the hook with a warning or less. In practical terms, law enforcement against corporate wrongdoers is plummeting under Trump. Public Citizen just released this study. It was in July. They released it. It's titled Corporate Impunity. And they found that in 11 of the 12 agencies led by Trump administration officials in 2017, penalties for corporate crime, penalties for corporate wrongdoing declined. In more than half of these agencies, penalties declined by more than 50%. With the steepest declines in the U.S. EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, 94% decline in enforcement. Just think about that for a minute. I mean, can you imagine if you were to learn that the police agencies, the police departments of, say, one particular city, let's say San Diego, there was a 94% crime, a 94% reduction in the arrest rate. So you'd see the crime rate drop, right? But crime isn't actually going down. Just the arrest rate is going down. 94%. What crimes are they ignoring? What crimes are they letting off the hook? I mean, it would have to be huge. It would have to be widespread. It would have to span a whole broad spectrum of activities and behaviors. What would it take for that kind of shift in behavior to be noticed by all of us, right? Hey, suddenly the cops are only arresting 6% of the people they used to arrest. Did crime go down? No, crime actually is now starting to go up. And corporate crime, of course, is going up in the face of this lack of prosecution, particularly by the Environmental Protection Agency. U.S. Department of Justice, 90% drop in prosecutions of billionaires and corporate criminals by the Justice Department. A 90% drop. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And, wow. Let's try Jesse in Sacramento. Hey, Jesse, you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can. What's on your mind?
Yes. There's this lady named Martha Harrison, the sexologist. And she said that what people do under the influence of alcohol and drugs, unconsciously, they've been thinking about it for a long time. And, they say the judge becomes a judge. So now you got a judge who's a undercover sex offender that he's going to let guys do whatever they want because, sex offenders are control freaks. That's all I got to say.
Okay. So Kavanaugh, having a past history of sexual assault, is more likely to go easy on cases of sexual assault. I get it. That makes perfect sense, Jesse. Thanks a lot for the call. Brian in Northampton, Massachusetts. Hey, Brian. Thanks for listening to WHMP. What's up?
Yeah, Tom, this is a hypothetical question, but could Chief Justice Roberts refuse to seat a new Supreme Court nominee, just as the House of Representatives can refuse to seat a newly elected House member for moral or ethical reasons?
I don't know. I don't know if the Chief Justice has the power to prevent somebody from sitting on the Supreme Court or not. I would guess not, but that would have to do with the rules of the Supreme Court. But I would consider it extremely unlikely that would happen. They're so into collegiality and letting everybody in that, yeah, I think and they have known Kavanaugh for 12 years. He's the D.C. Circuit and the Supreme Court are the two closest courts, senior courts, major courts, constitutional courts in the United States. So I doubt it would happen, but it's an interesting question. Thanks for raising it, Brian. I don't know the answer. Lewis in Joliet, Illinois. Hey, Lewis, what's up?
I got a bad connection here. Hopefully I can get through this.
Okay, go for it.
Now, which grandparents are we talking about for Kavanaugh that you said went to Yale?
It would be on his father's side. It would be his father's father because his last name was Kavanaugh.
Is that Everett Edward? Because that's
yes, Everett Edward. Yeah.
Okay, well, I only show him going to Georgetown University in '63, George Washington University in '70, and '78 American University. I don't see any Yale.
No, that's interesting. Well, I've seen it reported in a couple of different places. Perhaps it's wrong. So, Lewis, thanks for flagging that. I mean, we'll keep an eye on it. By the way, as I said, Mark Pocan will be coming in at the top of the hour in another, 7-8 minutes here to take your calls for the hour. So if you have questions for Congressman Pocan, give us a shout. We can put you on the queue. Pat in Palo Alto, California, listening on AM 910. Hey, Pat, what's up?
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
I just think that, to paint this guy as some kind of a drunken fool is just really off base because his academics. I mean, there's no way a guy can be as drunk, blackouts, all this, and still keep his academics like he did.
Why not?
I don't care
what if he's just really smart? He's a very, very smart drunken fool.
There you go. What if? See, you just put in a what if. Yeah,
I think what you're saying is a what if too, Pat.
Come on. Down because you don't want that seat in the Supreme Court. I understand it, but instead of being honest about it,
I don't recall any of this stuff happening when.
Hold on here. You want to
hold on here? Come on, give me a break. I don't recall any of this stuff happening when Neil Gorsuch was coming forward, and Neil Gorsuch took the seat that was stolen by Mitch McConnell. Nobody said, "Oh, Neil Gorsuch, he's got porn in his background. He's got sex in his background. He's got rape in his background. He's drinking too much." Nobody said any of that about Neil Gorsuch. And Neil Gorsuch went to Georgetown Prep. And he might have gone to some of the other schools, too. So, spare me your false furor, your feigned outrage. It's not selling here, no matter how hard you try to sell it. Eric in St. Louis Park, Minneapolis, listening on AM 950. Hey, Eric, what's up?
Hey, Tom. I got a question. If I got just Comcast as available to me as a cable company,
right,
and they're showing me, or I'm paying the bill, and then I'm being bombarded by all this advertisement and commercials, aren't they being paid by the advertising companies, and I have to pay them to watch it?
Yes.
I mean, that seems like a waste of my money. But anyway, can I slip in one more question?
Yeah, we have 1 minute.
Okay. If they control the news that we get, and what's going to keep them from promoting their own agenda? I mean, they're really going to make us dummy up. Your comments. Thank you.
Well, I think they are. I think this is what's happening. I think that, there's a very clear reason why you never hear a discussion of net neutrality on the networks that are now controlled by the big internet service providers. MSNBC owned by Comcast, CNN owned by AT&T. I mean, it's not even rocket science. It's just, oh, yeah, of course. There's a very good reason why you never hear on any of the television networks that are receiving hundreds of millions of dollars every year from the pharmaceutical industry about the crimes of big pharma. Mike Papantonio is reporting about this stuff, but you don't hear it on the networks. They won't even let him in. There's a reason why you don't hear about the fossil fuel industry. With the Koch brothers they're literally pouring this year $800 million into the election, or $300 million into the election. Most of that money is going to go to TV stations and television networks, and it's a lot of it's coming from fossil fuel and fossil fuel billionaires. Plus, you've got the up until maybe just 6 months ago, the oil industry used to very aggressively advertise. You've got the defense contractors advertising like crazy. There's a reason you don't hear them being taken on. So in the media, because the media is getting all this money from them. So those are the answers to the questions. Eric, thank you for the call. We'll be right back. It's coming up. Well, it's 57 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Welcome to the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from my book, Unequal Protection, The Rise of Corporate Dominance and the Theft of Human Rights. This is right after in the chapter where I lay out how the Supreme Court in 1886 actually did not rule that corporations are persons, even though the clerk of the court wrote that into the head note. And then we get into, where we got with this. This is page 109, the Republican conspiracy theory that empowered FDR. In the early 1930s, the stock market had collapsed and the world was beginning a long and dark slide into the Great Depression and eventually to World War II. Millions were out of work in the United States, and the questions on people's minds were, why did this happen and who's responsible? The teetering towers of wealth created by American industrialists during the late 1800s and early 1900s were largely thought to have contributed to or caused the stock market crash and ensuing depression. In less than 100 years, corporations had gone from being a legal fiction used to establish colleges and trading companies to standing as the single most powerful force in American politics. Many working people felt that corporations had seized control of the country's political agenda, capturing senators, congressmen, the Supreme Court, and even recent presidents in the magnetic force of their great wealth. Proof of this takeover could be found in Supreme Court decisions in the years between 1908 and 1914, when the Supreme Court, often citing corporate personhood, struck down minimum wage laws, workmen's compensation laws, utility regulation, and child labor laws, every kind of law that a people might institute to protect its citizenry from corporate abuse. Unions and union members were the victims of violence from private corporate armies and had been declared criminal conspiracies by both business leaders and politicians. It seemed that corporations had staged a coup, seizing the lives of American workers, the majority of voters, as well as the elected officials who were supposed to represent them. And this was in direct contradiction to the spirit expressed by the founders of our country. It was in this milieu that an American history book, first published in 1927 but largely ignored, suddenly became a hot topic. In The Rise of American Civilization, Columbia University history professor Charles Beard and women's suffragist Mary Beard suggested that the rise of corporations on the American landscape was the result of a grand conspiracy that reached from the boardrooms of the nation's railroads all the way to the Supreme Court. They fingered two Republicans, former Senator and railroad lawyer Roscoe Conkling, and former Congressman and railroad lawyer John A. Bingham. The theory, in short form, was that Conkling, when he was part of the Senate committee that wrote the 14th Amendment back in 1868, had intentionally inserted the word person instead of the correct legal phrase natural person to describe who would get the protections of that amendment. Bingham similarly worked in the House of Representatives to get the language passed. Once that time bomb was put into place, Conkling and Bingham left elective office to join in litigating on behalf of the railroads, with the goal of exploding their carefully worded amendment in the face of the Supreme Court. Thus, quote, Republican lawmakers, the Beards said, conspired in advance to give full human constitutional rights to corporate legal fictions. By a few words skillfully chosen, they wrote, every act of every state and local government which touched adversely the rights of corporate persons and property was made subject to review and liable to annulment by the Supreme Court at Washington, D.C. This conspiracy theory was widely accepted because the supposed conspirators themselves had said very publicly, we did it. Earlier, in an 1882 case pitting the railroads against San Mateo County, California, Conkling testified as a paid witness for the railroads that he had slipped the person language into the amendment, the 14th Amendment, to ensure that corporations would one day receive the same civil rights Congress was giving to freed slaves. Bingham made similar assertions when appropriate during his terms as a paid witness for the railroads. As a result of these assertions, through the late years of the 1800s, both of these two men were the well-off darlings of the railroad, basking in the light of their successful appropriation of human rights for corporations. When the Beards' book was widely read in the 1930s, it gave names and faces to the villains who had turned control of America over to what were then called the robber barons of industry. Conkling, Bingham, and Justice Waite were all dead by the time of the Great Depression and all judged guilty by the American people of pulling off the biggest con in the history of our republic. The firestorm of indignation that swept the country helped set the stage for Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Using legislative means and packing the Supreme Court to turn back corporate power, and that corporate takeover, at least in part, and returning to average working citizens some of the rights and benefits that they had felt had been stolen from them in that Supreme Court head note in 1886. It was widely accepted that Conkling and Bingham had pulled off this trick successfully, purposefully saying person instead of natural person or citizen when they helped write the 14th Amendment, and corporate personhood was a fait accompli. It was done and couldn't be undone. The Supreme Court, confronted with the reality of the language of the 14th Amendment, had been forced to recognize that corporations were persons under the U.S. Constitution because of the precedent of that 1886 Santa Clara case. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge apparently ratified the coup on January 8, 1915, when he unwittingly promulgated Conkling's myth in a speech to the Senate about the 1882 San Mateo case cited above. And so anyhow, the book is Unequal Protection by me. Free Speech TV is supported by your contributions, and I strongly encourage you during the pledge drives, or even not during the pledge drives, to call Free Speech TV at 877-378-8669 and make a contribution, support Free Speech TV. But that said, our program, the Thom Hartmann Program, what you're watching right now, is sustained by commercial advertising, and we're on commercial stations around the country. We run ads. They pay us for that. And one of the ways that you can support our program is by going to thomhartmann.com, our website, and clicking on the advertisements on that page for our sponsors and buying their products, supporting their products, or letting them know that you care about their products and that you support our show. That's thomhartmann.com, and click on the advertising there to support our program. We really appreciate it. We really appreciate your supporting Free Speech TV by your ongoing, calling and supporting the fundraising drives, and we also would really appreciate if you go to thomhartmann.com.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Thom Hartmann here with you, and Congressman Mark Pocan is on the line with us. It's our Middays with Mark Tuesday edition. It's you're going to be traveling tomorrow, I take it, Congressman?
Yep, and I think next Wednesday as well, sorry.
Oh, no, it's all good. It's all good.
Yeah.
We can move this around real easily, and I'm so glad that you can take calls for the hour. Our telephone number, 202-808-9925. And just real quick, Kavanaugh, I guess, is on the top of the news. What else is on your mind, and what are your thoughts about what's going on in the political world around us right now?
Yeah, I think still Kavanaugh is what dominates most of the conversation right now. The Saturday Night Live rendition of it seems to dominate a lot of conversation too, but we now know Brett Kavanaugh likes beer.
Boy, does he like beer.
Yeah, boy, I tell you, it was a bizarre day, and that happened after our last call last week, and I sat there and watched her give her testimony very, very credibly. And I
Dr.
watched
Ford.
the first few questions. Yeah, Dr. Ford. And then later, I caught some of the Brett Kavanaugh, and it just, she should be confirmed to the Supreme Court. I mean, she had temperament, she had everything you'd want in a judge, and then here this guy comes across and pulls an odd rendition of Donald Trump and lets everyone know how much he likes beer. It was just a really bizarre day, and then now we've got Republicans again still holding out against the Me Too movement and trusting. They say they believe Dr. Ford, except it's not him. Well, that's not believing Dr. Ford. So we'll see what happens this week. I mean, we're still watching to see whether or not they're going to try to force a vote this week, how wide the FBI investigation is. But I think there are a lot of moderate women who are watching this very closely and not very happy with the Republican response.
Yeah, although it's getting very, very aggressive. I even had a caller to the program in the last hour say, well, I'm looking at Kavanaugh's grandfather's college timeline, and he didn't go to Yale, after I'd said that he had lied about, he got in by his own hard work. And then somebody tweets, hey, that caller was talking about his grandfather going to college in the 60s. Sorry, that was his father. Kavanaugh went to college in the 80s, and of course his father didn't go to Yale, but his grandfather did, so apparently he got in as a legacy student. But, apparently the BS is traveling really, really rapidly in the right-wing circles. It's even leaking into this program. So
yeah, this is, huge for them, right? This is the only thing that, is being talked about in Washington both last week and this week. So, I mean, to gain 2 weeks of a news cycle, clearly this is what people are paying attention to, even though, yesterday we saw a NAFTA, redo, introduced. We're still trying to figure it all out. But, there's a lot of other things happening, but this is what's getting the oxygen.
Yeah, it looks like the NAFTA thing has some really big gifts for Monsanto in it. It does away with the anti-GMO law in Mexico. And Monsanto's going to be very happy about that.
Well, and pharmaceuticals, some types of pharmaceuticals are going to have longer periods of time protection, stopping things getting generic to the market to make it more affordable for consumers. I mean, to be fair, we're still looking at it all. Friday, I went to the classified SCIF, in the Capitol to look at what we had so far with the negotiations with Mexico at the time, because we didn't have any language from Canada. I can tell you, while there's some marginally better provisions in the labor chapter, which is really important to me, at the same time, the enforcement side is almost very fuzzy or non-existent. So you can have decent language in some areas, but if it's not actually going to ever be real, then it doesn't mean so much. And we did hear about the pharmaceutical problems. Environmental laws are not very good in this. So we're still waiting to get all the language to take a close look. But, for him to act as big as this was, it is not. I mean, much of this language was what Barack Obama had negotiated for the TPP anyway.
Sure.
And
he's just rebranding. That's what he does. He somebody has an office building and he goes to them and he says, "Hey, give me 5% or 10% and you can put the Trump name on it." Well, that's exactly what he just did with NAFTA. And also, one of the big bragging points is they got rid of the investor-state dispute resolution tribunals. Turns out, at least if NBC News was correct this morning, when Canada said, "Yeah, we'll participate," one of the conditions of their participation was that those tribunals come back into the deal. So,
yeah, and there's a whole, and the Buy American provision stuff is not clear at all what was in there yet. We don't know
it
that.
Looks like that got blown up.
Yeah, so it's pretty early to do any real assessments, other than the things we've pointed out are still pretty faulty.
Yeah. So let's pick up some phone calls here. This is your hour, and a lot of people want to talk to you. Gary in Toronto, Canada. Hey, Gary, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hey, thanks for taking my call. I guess I wasn't expecting to speak to him, but I just wanted to make a general comment that by profession, I'm an ethical hacker for my company. And observing the political system in the United States right now, I can notice that the system is compromised. And no matter what you do, unless you do a complete flush, you're not going to get rid of it. For example, this person who's nominated, being written off as somebody who's a fool, especially quite an intelligent person, dangerous and lethal in some cases. Just like Citizens United was broadened by Justice Robert Kennedy, this person will do the same to other legislation that has been settled and make it so that you have the Citizens United effect. If you follow my lead on that.
Yeah, it was Anthony Kennedy, but on the Supreme Court. Yeah. But yeah, absolutely. So, and let's get Congressman Pocan's thoughts on that. That's an interesting metaphor. You got to flush the system.
Gary, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I think actually what you are saying from Toronto is what I'm hearing often in the district. people sometimes get really discouraged. I've been doing this in local, state, and federal government now for close to 30 years, and I know the system can work, and there is a pendulum that swings. But when you have things weighted like Citizens United, or you have things weighted like how they're behaving with the Supreme Court nomination, it makes people very, very discouraged. The problem is one of their main strategies is discourage you to the point that you don't care enough to vote, because they know that people agree with the progressive side of issues in this country. They have the money, we have the people and the issues, but if they can somehow dissuade people, make them want to think that everything stinks, they don't get out, they win. So there is a real methodology to what they do, and this is a very specific tactic that they put out there. We just have to make sure people understand just the opposite.
Yeah.
We change the faces of some of these people who don't like what they're doing in Congress, and we can really change the ways our government runs.
Marcia in Inglewood, Florida. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi. Thanks, Tom, and hi, Congressman. Good to talk to you again.
Hi, Marcia.
I have a question about, you can count on one hand in 5 minutes how many times Kavanaugh has literally lied. That's perjury under oath. That's a criminal offense. And I'm trying to figure out why the Democratic Party doesn't bring criminal charges against him in state court. Are they not allowed to bring charges against him in state court? Or why aren't they doing anything about the perjury?
Yeah, and I would add, Bill Clinton was impeached for perjury and was disbarred. He lost his law license for perjury.
Yeah, and some of this on the most recent, perjuries around, like, what the yearbook said and things, people would argue whether or not they're material, they're strong enough that you could get to that level. I would argue what people have kind of forgot about because of the very serious allegations by Dr. Ford, that we're forgetting that he probably committed perjury 4 or maybe 5 times in some previous testimony that actually I think is more substantial, right? That he lied maybe previously when he was before the Senate for confirmation, according to former Senator Russ Feingold from Wisconsin. So I think what people have been saying, and I think this is probably the most relevant to offer, Marcia, is that, we're going to do everything we can to stop this nomination for a lot of very valid reasons. But should he get through and should we win the majority, we can do hearings on this and we can really get to the bottom of this. And, there is a process to impeach. I'm not saying it's easy, but we can certainly do things that we need to if they decide to force this vote.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting time to be in the middle of this political swirl. Congressman Mark Pocan is with us taking your calls. It's the Tuesday edition of Middays with Mark. He's on the road tomorrow, and we'll be picking up your calls in just a few minutes. You can find Congressman Pocan's website at pocan.house.gov. You can tweet him at Rep, as in Representative, Rep Mark Pocan. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Defending America from the weapons of mass deception. We'll be back with more of Congressman Mark Pocan. Tuesday edition of Middays with Mark. It's 16 minutes past the hour. And welcome back. Mick in Santa Cruz, California. You are on the air with Congressman Mark Pocan.
Hello. Thank you for taking my call, and thank you for all you're doing. I'm very, very disturbed by the fact that the conversation on both medias, all medias, doesn't seem to talk about the internment of the children in the camps, that about immigration. It's about the fact that these kids, just like in the past, are being mistreated. We passed laws in the past against the cruelty for animals before we did children. So children seems to be not the issue. Kavanaugh is, and I'm disturbed by that.
Yeah, Mick, I've got to agree with you on the tent city right now that they've put down in Texas, where I'm actually looking for the number. I think it's expanded 13. To accommodate 3,800 children. Yeah, and then there's 13,000 in total that are being looked at. And this is a for-profit prison, by the way. Exactly. And that's the thing, is all these centers, the amount of money we're spending on this is huge, and the conditions are not probably up to the appropriate conditions that you'd have to do. And you're right, it hasn't gotten attention. We got attention for a while on the family separation issue, even though there's still a lot of children that aren't reunited. And then there's a whole bunch of unaccompanied minors who were placed that we've lost contact with. I think it's over 1,000 there. And now we're talking about a tent city for potentially 3,800 children. So those are all things that I think are terrible, make the country look bad, and should be getting more attention. But you're right, the corporate media, right now they're focused on Kavanaugh and Kavanaugh pretty much alone. But we do need to make sure people realize that what is being done in the name of the United States.
Amen. Gordo in Springfield, Tennessee, watching Free Speech TV. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yeah, how you doing, man? I want to do a shout out for Free Speech TV because I really appreciate the quality of your guys' honesty, man.
Thanks, Gordo.
I've got something to say, man. I was also assaulted as a child, and I'm male and everything, and it was hard for me. And I think of myself as a man, as a tough guy. Not tough guy, but somebody of strength. As far as mentally concerned. And it was really hard for me to come out. I didn't come out until I was like 12, 13 when I told my real father about what happened. And the thing is, I had an argument with somebody that came in the other day, and they said, well, I was watching something about a North Korean girl that came overseas and, got freedom, And he's telling me, you can't believe her. She's a professional politician. Look the way she's moving her hands. You can't, because she was talking about being raped and stuff. And I got up and I said, "Excuse me, let me tell you something. I was molested, and I have no proof of that, none whatsoever. And I'm telling you, I was there. And for everybody to criticize Miss Ford and make her feel stupid and make her look stupid, and not, we have a 4th and 5th Amendment right to be heard.
Yeah.
And if there's an allegation, it should, without
Gordo,
a doubt.
spot on. We just have 10 seconds here left for Congressman Pocan to respond to you.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, the fact that the Republicans treated this doctor so poorly when I think most of America really felt and empathized with her, they're making a huge mistake.
Agreed. We'll be back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan in just a moment. It's coming up on 20 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program, the place where smart people get their news. Stick around. Free Speech TV is supported by your contributions, and I strongly encourage you during the pledge drives, or even not during the pledge drives, to call Free Speech TV at 877-378-8669 and make a contribution, support Free Speech TV. But that said, our program, the Thom Hartmann Program, what you're watching right now, is sustained by commercial advertising, and we're on commercial stations around the country. We run ads. They pay us for that. And one of the ways that you can support our program is by going to thomhartmann.com, our website, and clicking on the advertisements on that page for our sponsors and buying their products, supporting their products, or letting them know that you care about their products and that you support our show. That's thomhartmann.com, and click on the advertising there to support our program. We really appreciate it. We really appreciate your supporting Free Speech TV by your ongoing, calling and supporting the fundraising drives, and we also would really appreciate if you go to thomhartmann.com.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
And Congressman Kevin in Long Island, New York is on the line. Kevin, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, guys. Good afternoon.
Hey, Kevin.
Listen, I've been hearing a lot about, especially when Senator Flake was confronted by the victims of sexual assault. I'm a victim of a false and fabricated sexual assault allegation that took place. And I can tell you that the 19 months that I went through before that was resolved and I was exonerated was the most painful, the most depressing, and the most embarrassing time of my life. And I almost lost everything that I worked hard for all those years. You said that you said you didn't appreciate the way that Kavanaugh reacted to the senators. Well, I'll tell you, I felt his anger because that's how I felt. And I feel it's unfair for somebody to judge somebody else in that situation unless you walk a mile in their shoes. And the other issue that I have is with due process here. If by the standard that some people are advocating for, where accusations are treated as fact, I today would be considered a sexual offender, a violent sexual offender, for an act that I absolutely did not commit, and I would not have any opportunity to be in the point that I am right now. And it hurts me to see that. I see that within the Bill of Rights is an inalienable right to due process. You can't deprive a person of life or liberty without due process. I don't see anything in there where there's a right for a person to be able to have justice done for every instance. It happens. But to me, it's a bigger deal, and it should be a bigger deal to many Americans, if you deprive a person of an inalienable right over the fact that a victim of any crime may not get the justice that they deserve. It's an imperfect system, but it's the system that we have, and it's what differentiates us from oppressive regimes and other dictatorships.
Kevin, let's get the Congressman's response.
Yeah, Kevin, so first of all, I think it's horrible for someone to make a false accusation, because you will go through something that, as you explained, you yourself went through. Here's the problem, though, on Brett Kavanaugh, on his reaction. He was asked, I think, 5 times or at least by 5 different senators, and I thought Dick Durbin, did it probably the most aggressively. Would you be open to an FBI investigation? I think, Kevin, you would have been, because you would have had your name cleared by a third-party source and maybe not had to wait all that time. But the fact that he wouldn't agree to it, and they only did it after a Republican potential vote, Jeff Flake said he wouldn't proceed unless they did it, tells me it doesn't pass the upper Midwest smell test. Why wouldn't you want that third-party validation, which, if he did nothing wrong, should have been able to come out? So that's the problem and the difference. Not saying that it's fair whenever someone is falsely accused, but I thought she came across extremely genuine, and I thought his answers on a number of questions were untruthful, as we all know from that testimony that day. But the fact that he wouldn't ask for the FBI to clear his name, to me, that alone said an awful lot.
Vicki in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Hey, Vicki, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi. I just had a question in regards to Kavanaugh getting through or not. How would this affect the Gamble versus U.S., being that he would be the fifth one to then pull over the separate sovereigns, or the double jeopardy, where it wouldn't be able to be just federal, it would be state?
Yeah, I mean, I think we might have talked about this a little bit last week. I mean, if he gets on the court, he's a very solid fifth conservative vote for the court. And, I think a lot of things could be in jeopardy, especially along the choice and some other lines that we saw where maybe Justice Kennedy wasn't a pure 100% conservative. Kavanaugh is, and that's why they're fighting so aggressively for him. So
in the Gamble case, though, this guy has been charged by the feds and charged by a state a state court, and he's saying that the exception that was made to the double jeopardy clause in the Constitution, I think it's in the Fifth Amendment, that exception that was made 150 years ago by the Supreme Court, that said that if you are prosecuted by the feds, you can still and you are then pardoned, you can still, or even found not guilty, you can still be prosecuted by the state. He's saying that's double jeopardy. And if they all agree that that's double jeopardy, that means that if Trump issues a pardon to Manafort or anybody else, that pardon will work at the state level as well as the federal level. And that's what's got a lot of people flipped out. This case was brought a day after Anthony Kennedy announced his resignation.
And that's kind of where I was going with it. Also, just the fact that Brett Kavanaugh has said you don't think you can go after a president while they're in office. Right. Another reason that for Donald Trump provides some protection. So those are a couple more reasons why Brett Kavanaugh is especially troublesome because again, he's one vote, but he could be one very strong vote coming in with that attitude in a becoming more partisan court.
Yeah. Congressman, we're just 30 seconds out from the break at the bottom of the hour, which is a hard break. How do you see this playing out?
I think the real test will be whether or not they have a full FBI investigation. I think I was told unless they have the report done by tomorrow, it's very difficult to do a Friday vote. And I assume they're going to want to make sure they talk to everybody. And there's a lot of logical things that whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, if you're going to do the FBI investigation, do it right. And I think there's going to be some debate about that. I don't know if they'll have the vote or not this week. If they do, I think it's a mistake.
Yeah. If they do, you think it's going to go which way?
I think if they do, that means they've got the vote. I don't think they're going to call it if they do.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I think in this case, if they win, they lose.
Oh, that's interesting. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. It's the Tuesday edition of Middays with Mark. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
You can check out Congressman Pocan's website at pocan.house.gov. You can tweet him at Rep. Mark Pocan. He'll be back with your calls right after this. For our book club today, we're reading Out of the Wreckage, A New Politics for an Age of Crisis by George Monbiot. This is from Chapter 3, Don't Look Back. The political history of the second half of the 20th century could be summarized as the conflict between its two great narratives, neoliberalism and social democracy. Social democracy in this era, whose story I briefly summarized in Chapter 1, acquired much of its power and coherence from the thinking of one remarkable man. Across 4 decades, John Maynard Keynes's work dominated economic thought and practice. During the period the French called the Trente Glorieuses, 1945 to 1975, his prescriptions are widely credited with reviving economies and distributing their benefits. That they remain more or less the only mainstream alternative to neoliberalism today reveals a remarkable stagnation of both thought and ambition. The first and most obvious problem with an attempt to use Keynesian social democracy as a core political narrative is that the story is more than 80 years old. Political stories need to be renewed. If politics does not feel fresh, it struggles to kindle the imaginative excitement from which hope arises. The second problem is that the surviving enthusiasm for Keynes among mainstream parties is highly selective. It has been reduced in most cases to lowering interest rates when economies are sluggish and engaging in tepid counter-cyclical public spending, which means injecting public money into the economy when unemployment is high or recession threatens. Other Keynesian measures, such as raising taxes when an economy grows quickly to dampen the boom-bust cycle, the fixed exchange rate system, capital controls, and a self-balancing global banking system, an international clearing union, all of which Keynes saw as essential complements to these policies, have been discarded and forgotten. Not only does this ensure that the rich old story has been reduced to two thin chapters, whose loss of context destroys their narrative power, but the absence of other Keynesian measures, as well as changed global circumstances, weakens the effectiveness of the remaining elements of policy. Let me give you an example. In 2009, in the hope of boosting the economy in the wake of the financial crash, the British government spent £300 million on stimulating sales of new cars. Under its scrappage scheme, if car owners traded in their old vehicles for new ones, the government, with the help of manufacturers, knocked £2,000 off the price. This lavish program was partly justified as an environmental measure, though it was clear from the outset that it would lead to a rise in environmental impacts as the materials and energies used in manufacturing new cars outweigh any likely savings from better fuel economy. Its primary purpose was to boost British car assembly plants and protect the jobs of their workers. But European state aid rules forbade such schemes from discriminating between cars made in Britain and cars made abroad. British car parts assembled only some 15% of the vehicles sold in that country, which meant that 85% of the benefit went to car plants in Germany, Japan, and other manufacturing nations. We could see this spending as foreign aid to some of the world's richest nations. The current pattern of globalization, which developed partly as a result of abandoning the fixed exchange rates and capital controls that Keynes advocated, ensures that this problem is to some extent repeated wherever Keynesian stimulus spending is applied. It might lead to a general, if scarcely detectable, global economic uplift, but the domestic impact will necessarily be weaker than Keynes intended. This issue is compounded by the phenomena of job-free growth, caused in part by the automation now spreading into almost every economic sector. Today, governments pull the starter cord, spending public money and cutting interest rates, that ignited the economy and employment in the past, only to discover that it snaps before the motor fires. Two feeble measures, removed from the rich framework of thought and narrative in which they were once embedded, have little chance of sustaining a political revival. Another issue is that the troubles that beset the Keynesian model in the 1970s have not disappeared. While the oil embargo of '73 was the immediate trigger for the lethal combination of high inflation and high unemployment, called stagflation back then, that Keynesian policies were almost powerless to counteract. Problems with the system had been mounting for years. Falling productivity and rising costs push inflation, wages and prices pursuing each other upwards, were already beginning to erode support for Keynesian economics. Most importantly, perhaps, the program had buckled in response to the political demands of capital. Strong financial regulations and controls on the movement of money began to weaken in the 1950s as governments started to liberalize financial markets. Richard Nixon's decision in '71 to suspend the convertibility of dollars into gold destroyed the system of fixed exchange rates on which much of the success of Keynes's policies depended. The capital controls introduced to prevent financiers and speculators from sucking money out of balanced Keynesian economies collapsed. Today, it's hard to find a mainstream politician in Europe or the Anglophone nations, including those who call themselves Keynesians, prepared to call for their reintroduction. We cannot hope that the strategies deployed by global finance that helped to destroy the efficacy of Keynes's measures in the '70s will be unlearned. If the soft Keynesianism proposed by opponents of neoliberalism is to amount to anything but tinkering, it has to confront a wider set of challenges than most of its advocates have yet been prepared to acknowledge. But perhaps the biggest problem residual Keynesianism confronts in the 21st century is that when it does work, it collides headfirst with the environmental crisis. The book, Out of the Wreckage by George Monbiot.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
All's well that ends well. Thom Hartmann here with you, and Congressman Mark Pocan on the phone taking your calls for the hour. And I thought we had a Wisconsin caller here. I guess they gave up. Russ in Hickory Hills, Illinois. Hey, Russ, what's up?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Pocan. This is just throwing this out there. Mr. Pocan, now that you guys are on break, are the Democrats this enthused to vote, as I keep hearing? And do we have a 20-point lead among the women? Because that's all I hear. Suburban women are leaving the Republican Party. That's kind of hard to believe. They're loyalists. They're not like us because, let's be honest, we put Donald Trump in the White House of Democrats. What is the bottom line when you're on the road? Are we that enthused?
Yeah, Russ. So I've been in Omaha and Des Moines and Wisconsin. I'm heading to Minnesota next week. I'm going to Michigan, getting around to lots of different places. I can tell you our base is very motivated. Elections have consequences, and they fully understand that from 2016. Their base is less motivated. Family separation, Donald Trump's demeanor, et cetera, has certainly dampened that. But since Labor Day, we've seen this kind of a burst of extra energy, especially among independents. And so Wisconsin, we had 2 special elections for state Senate races where suburban voters, especially women, were key. These are people who aren't Democrats, aren't Republicans, but are tired of being forced into awkward conversations with their kids about porn stars and S-holes and very fine Klansmen and Nazis. And we've noticed this happening more and more, and especially since Labor Day. So that is true, but we have to get all of them out to vote. They may be with us now, but we've got to make sure they're with us in a few weeks to get out to vote, which is why all the activities that everyone's doing across the country right now, campaigning, really are going to be the determining factor of whether or not people come out and vote.
Travis, listening to AM 1350 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hello. If this is Travis talking,
yep,
I just want to know. Okay, thank you. Just want to know, what is it going to take for us to go to a fair paper ballot system without technology for voting as far as when we win the House?
Yeah, great question, Travis. And I just actually last week, Wednesday or Thursday, sat down with John Sarbanes from Maryland, who's kind of leading our good government efforts. I'm on a task force with him. He's leading it. I'm one of the vice chairs. And we've got we're advocating for H.R. 1, the first bill we introduced, to be a bill that deals with electoral reform, campaign finance reform, and ethics reform, all in one bill. And I am advocating very strongly to get something added about paper ballots because I already have legislation that does just that. But I think, if people want that confidence that their ballot, should there be a recount, we actually have a physical specimen that we can take a look at and count. So I'm hoping that will get added. I'm still advocating for that, but you make a great point. That will add a lot to the confidence in our elections.
John in Auburn, Washington, listening on KBCS. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, this is John. Thank you, Tom, for taking my call, and good to hear you again. Hey, I'm a little impressed by how vociferous and angry we've become over the possible sexual assault of Judge. But you know what? It seems like the Democrats have dropped the ball on the 90% of the materials of his government service while he was working for George W. Republicans, where we just did not get to find out almost anything about his record of service and what he was actually doing during that time.
During the time he worked for George W. Bush. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Your call waiting kept blocking what you were saying, John, so I was just repeating George W. Bush. Congressman, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, John, I think what's happening right now is what's capturing the public's attention, and they may not be exactly enthralled by what happened when he worked under George W. Bush, because not everyone follows politics as closely as we all do. But what they really understand is when a woman makes a very credible accusation and is really dismissed the way Dr. Ford has been dismissed, and then the good old boy, I like beer network kicks in. I think that's what's capturing people's attention and saying, let's have that proper FBI investigation. Why wouldn't he want to have it, right? And it's something that people can relate to very easily and feel very emotionally about, and I think that's why that just is what's getting most of the attention. I also think that, his lying in the previous testimony 4 or 5 times is of significance. But right now, I think where the public's at is on this moment and Dr. Ford's testimony and the other women's testimonies, but accusations and what that means moving forward. So that's just what's captured the public's interest right now.
Nancy, listening to WTTN in Wisconsin. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yeah, one thing I'm worried about listening to a Michael Lewis interview, which was his book should be very, very good. His articles in Vanity Fair were absolutely frightening. But I think we're in a really grave situation and Trump doing something off the wall, like, tariffs, whatever, that would really upset China. If they would cut us off, other than, the stuff to make our missiles and everything, but like just about everything you need in the hospital, including our drugs, are from China. Is there something, without appearing too socialist, that the government can do to put this in reverse?
Yeah, well, I think, Nancy, when it comes to China, this is all very interesting because Donald Trump talks a real tough game. But don't forget, when he became president, that's when he started getting some of the trademarks for his family businesses, right, with China. And if you really want to address in my opinion, one of the very biggest problems that we have in relation to trade with China, it's currency manipulation. China is a manipulator of their currency, and you can have the best laws written, you can have tariffs in place, and all that can be manipulated by currency. And because of the power of the financial institutions, that's not something we're going after. So once again, I don't even know if his rhetoric matches his actions because he's not going after what would really provide substantial change. Instead, he's doing this tariff war, which there's a lot we could discuss on that, good and bad, but he's not going at the real problem because of the financial institutions. And if I can add, Tom, in NAFTA, that's one of the areas I think that got weakened was around financial institutions also.
Yeah, ouch. Cammie in Lakewood, Colorado. Am I saying your name right?
Did you say Cammie?
Yeah, I did. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi there. I wanted to just get your take on this. On the Kavanaugh hearings, and he's not really on a criminal trial. It's not a civil trial. Isn't it more or less a fancy job interview? And they keep pushing it, and his life's not ruined. If he doesn't get the job, he'll probably go back to being a judge, what he was doing before. I just wanted to get your take on it. And of course, we all know why they're pushing Kavanaugh, but we're setting the rules of a criminal and civil trial when he's really not on trial technically. What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, they're testing his truthfulness, his character. That's what they're looking at. But you're right, it is. It's a job interview. In fact, I think one of the best lines from Saturday Night Live wasn't in that skit they did of the hearing, but later when I think it's Michael Che said, generally if you're bringing up your drunkenness and sexual assault in an interview, you're not going to get the job, right? And you'd think that would be significant enough, the fact that these are the conversations. And then when he lied to the members of the Senate on a number of definitions and trying to recreate, let's face it, he told us he likes beer very clearly. We know he likes beer. I think from his actions, I've got the feeling he was a pretty belligerent drunk when he was a younger person, and that alone shouldn't be disqualifying. However, if there are these sexual assault allegations and he's lying about what happened at the time on other things, that certainly adds to the credibility of someone who is to be appointed to a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. So I think all of these are valid parts of the discussion that came out, and I think, hopefully the Senate Republicans actually look at it on its merits rather than just they're going to get this because they might lose the Senate on November 6th. And I think they make some huge mistakes, and also just on how you treat people. I mean, hopefully this is putting a real emphasis on sexual assault and the Me Too movement. And I heard there have been a lot more people reporting sexual assaults because of this, and maybe it's opening that up so that people can be more forward about what's happening. But all this is fair game when you want to be on the Supreme Court, and when you're lying to members of the Senate about even little things, people have to question where you are on the bigger things, especially when there's a very credible assault accusation.
Amen. Jim in Chicago, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan. We have a minute and a half to the break.
Yes, gentlemen, I have a quick question, and it's not apropos of Kavanaugh or anything, and I apologize for that. But I've been ignorant about something for a long time, and I thought maybe you could educate me. Is there any law, anything in the Constitution prohibiting us as a society from capping interest rates at like 10%? Banks, stores, credit card companies could charge 10% and no more.
Nixon was the one who took those laws down. It was capped at 10% up until 72, Congressman, 71?
Yeah. No, I'm not sure the year, but yeah, you can definitely affect that. I mean, we still do often state by state on predatory lenders, on payday loan folks and others, so you can definitely regulate that.
Yeah, we have nationwide usury laws, federal usury laws that capped interest rates at 10%, which meant the credit card companies couldn't charge more than 10%. They're charging 30% now.
Yeah.
This is craziness.
Their power in Washington is also crazy.
Yeah, we have about 30 seconds to the break. Do you see any changes in this? Is there any effort to roll back the stranglehold that the lenders have on small borrowers?
My guess is the first thing we're going to have to do is fix some of the attacks they've done on Dodd-Frank. Since Republicans have been in control, they have done a number of measures, including some things that brought back some of the risky behavior around derivatives.
Yeah, there you go. Interesting times. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. It's Middays with Mark, Tuesday edition, hour 2 here on the Thom Hartmann Program. We'll be back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan in just a moment. You can check out his website at pocan.house.gov. You can tweet him at Rep, R-E-P, as in Representative, Rep Mark, M-A-R-K, Pocan, P-O-C-A-N. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
It's the Thom Hartmann Program, the place where despair is not an option. Middays with Mark, Tuesday edition. And welcome back. John in Flint, Michigan, watching us on YouTube. Hey, John, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Congressman. I just had one question about the trade war, so-called trade war. Because Russia and other nations are trying to undercut the dollar and sell off their American debt, aren't they just using the tariffs to raise money for the Treasury? And by virtue, taxing the citizens?
I guess, John, that's the net effect of a tariff, but I don't think that's the reason why. I think, Donald Trump has used them without a lot of rhyme or reason. I'm not against using tariffs. The targeted tariffs, especially against countries that violate the rules, can be used very effectively. I'm not sure I'm seeing that right now from the Trump administration. It's very inconsistent. We're fighting with allies in Canada and Europe. China, like I said, they're not addressing some of the major issues around currency manipulation. So I don't think it's done just for the revenue, because some of these may be short-term if they can get some other deals. I just think it's done without a logical path to what they're trying to accomplish.
Alan in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yes, Congressman. Thank you for taking my call. My question is, do you think there should be term limits on Supreme Court justices?
Good question, Alan. I honestly have never been asked that or thought about that as a question. So
I'm proposing 18 years.
18 years?
Yeah, and then schedule it in the way they did with the Senate when they went to every 2 years, and so that over that period of time, so that every president will have an opportunity to appoint a couple of Supreme Court justices. I'd also expand the size of the court to 13.
I was going to say that's the other question that comes up probably a little more often, which is, should we have a larger Supreme Court, because of some of the difficulties we're facing right now with the appointment process and just the court itself. So Yeah, I mean, those are all possibilities. But, Alan, let me think about it a little more. I'm not sure. Tom, if I can, two people have tweeted things, if I can just, because I want people to know I do read when they're tweeting while we're watching the show. The woman who asked about the slander, I brought the question to impeachment response. She said, but you didn't really answer the question about perjury. Could you still go back after someone from the first FBI investigation with perjury charges? I'm assuming you could, Marcia. I'm sorry I didn't get it to directly. I was kind of going to where a lot of the conversation is that likely if he gets appointed Friday, which they seem to be pushing really quickly, the way to remove him would be an impeachment process as opposed to, perjury charges, which could lead to maybe an impeachment process. And the second one, Tom, is just it's kind of a funny one, but I thought it was good when we were talking about the impeach Kavanaugh. They said a new slogan for 2019, if necessary, impeach Kavanaugh. It's good practice, and I just thought that was pretty funny. So
that is a good one. We're 31 seconds away from the break that ends this break. So if we were to term limit the Supreme Court justices, that would require a constitutional amendment, wouldn't it? Isn't lifetime tenure in the Constitution? I'm looking at.
Pretty sure, yes.
I've got to look for Article.
It says it would to change the number, I believe, too.
Article 3, yeah. Yeah, shall at all times. Well, actually, the judges both of the Supreme and inferior courts shall hold their offices during good behavior and shall at stated times receive compensation.
Yeah, most of the conversation has been on the size of the court rather than the length of terms, but
I'm not sure it says lifetime appointment here. I just reread original jurisdiction, trial of all crimes. Yeah. No, it doesn't say lifetime. So this is something that could be done legislatively. It wouldn't require an amendment.
Let's look, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Fascinating stuff. Okay, we'll be back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan right after this. Free Speech TV is supported by your contributions, and I strongly encourage you during the pledge drives, or even not during the pledge drives, to call Free Speech TV at 877-378-8669 and make a contribution, support Free Speech TV. But that said, our program, the Thom Hartmann Program, what you're watching right now, is sustained by commercial advertising, and we're on commercial stations around the country. We run ads. They pay us for that. And one of the ways that you can support our program is by going to thomhartmann.com, our website, and clicking on the advertisements on that page for our sponsors and buying their products, supporting their products, or letting them know that you care about their products and that you support our show. That's thomhartmann.com, and click on the advertising there to support our program. We really appreciate it. We really appreciate your supporting Free Speech TV by your ongoing, calling and supporting the fundraising drives, and we also would really appreciate if you go to thomhartmann.com.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Your calls here on Middays with Mark, Tuesday edition, and Russ in Portland, Oregon. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yeah, Congressman Pocan, I was just wondering if you had heard about the 1985 drunken bar brawl in New Haven, where Brett Kavanaugh started it by throwing ice at another bar patron, got into a fight, and then none other than Chris Dudley, the guy who ran for governor here in Oregon several years ago, and almost, not quite, but almost beat our legendary Democratic governor, John Kitzhaber. Dudley picked up he broke a bar glass and thrust the broken bar glass into the side of the head of Bretti's adversary, and there was blood all over the place. The cops were called. There was a police report. And this kind of drunken behavior flies in the face, in my opinion, of what he told the Senate Judiciary Committee about his he really didn't have any problem with alcohol. I think he perjured himself when he said that. And anyway,
Russ, I did hear that story. I do concur. I mean, there's been so many of his roommates and others who have said very different stories, so it does appear that he wasn't truthful with the Senate. But, something else you bring up that really stood out to me was, this is a guy who shows extraordinary privilege and was shocked that anyone would say no to him or question him, and his aggressive, belligerent behavior based on that, again, just reinforced his privileged status that he thinks he's owed, and so somehow he's entitled to the seat rather than this is a job interview for the seat. And I also found that to be pretty extraordinary.
Chuck in Missoula, Montana. You're on with Congressman Pocan.
Hey, Congressman.
Hey, Chuck.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, I got a question on if we're looking into caring for women. Why aren't we looking into releasing all the cover-up of all the congressmen that have been paid off for abusing women, or Keith Ellison or Cory Booker, their accusers?
I'm sorry, can you say it again?
He said he's suggesting that Keith Ellison, it was just, he's a guy trying to get this in here. Keith Ellison, by the way, the charges against him were just disproven yesterday. And I don't know anything about Cory Booker. But
yeah,
that's
there's lots of
I think he's picking
Breitbart sort of talking points.
Yeah,
out
picking
there
male
on
black Democrats.
Yeah.
It's that's awful stuff.
Gotcha.
Monty in Los Osos, California. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Oh, thank you. First time, long time. And I wanted to ask the congressman: is there any way that we can put this judge appointment off until the next election, the way the Republicans did to Mr. Garland?
By the rules, they're going by no. That's the problem. If they have Jeff Flake or Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski, no, they'll have the votes lined up. The question is, is this going to be a thorough, real FBI investigation, which everyone's asked for, or is this going to be some kind of a abbreviated or more narrow one, which then didn't resolve the problem at all? We're yet to find that out, and hopefully we will this week.
Gordon, listening to Sirius XM in Jasper, Oregon. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Tom and Congressman. My question is, can we hold the Republican committee complicit if they vote for Kavanaugh knowing he's perjured himself?
Is there any kind of penalty for them outside of voting them out of office?
Yeah, not really. I don't believe so, other than obviously their constituents could say you didn't do a thorough job, you didn't do what you were elected to, therefore we're not going to keep you in office. That may be your best recourse.
That is. Patty in Fort Lauderdale, listening on iHeartRadio. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yeah, hey, I got a real quick one. If Kavanaugh is telling the truth, why isn't he suing Ford for defamation, slander, or libel?
Yeah,
it's more rhetorical than anything.
Yeah, Patty, interesting point to put out there. You're right. Again, I look at things from a very simple kind of upper Midwest perspective. If he didn't want the FBI investigation to clear his name, that alone didn't pass the smell test, right? Like there's something more to it. And the fact that this only happened because Jeff Flake, said, I'm not going to vote unless you do this. This wasn't asked for by Kavanaugh, who should have been the person asking for it to clear his name.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the biggest problem I see with his story.
Well, even Clarence Thomas was all in favor of an FBI investigation, or at least said so. He didn't object to it. So, Congressman, we have about 30, 40 seconds here left. What should we be looking for this week?
It's all about Kavanaugh as far as what you're looking for, I think. The other thing, maybe just to spend a little attention to watch is, Rod Rosenstein was supposed to go to meet with the president last Thursday during the Kavanaugh hearing. That got delayed, but, that's still out there, and at some point that could be done while people are paying attention to the Kavanaugh hearing. So pay attention to that as well, because that would certainly trigger response around the country.
Do you think Trump initially did that as a way of diverting attention from the Kavanaugh hearing, and then when he realized it wasn't possible, he gave up?
Potentially, but again, who knows? If this guy thought like normal people do, you could predict it's a little harder with him.
Yeah, that is true. Although I think we're starting to see some trends emerging. The con artist and the media manipulator and everything else. Congressman, thanks so much for doing this hour with us today. And
absolutely,
good travels, and I hope you have great success on the road.
Thank you very much, Tom. I appreciate it.
Congressman Mark Pocan. Check out his website at pocan.house.gov, and you can tweet him at @RepMarkPocan. We'll be back with the rest of the program right after this.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
For our book club today, we're reading Out of the Wreckage, A New Politics for an Age of Crisis by George Monbiot. This is from Chapter 3, Don't Look Back. The political history of the second half of the 20th century could be summarized as the conflict between its two great narratives, neoliberalism and social democracy. Social democracy in this era, whose story I briefly summarized in Chapter 1, acquired much of its power and coherence from the thinking of one remarkable man. Across 4 decades, John Maynard Keynes's work dominated economic thought and practice. During the period the French called the Trente Glorieuses, 1945 to 1975, his prescriptions are widely credited with reviving economies and distributing their benefits. That they remain more or less the only mainstream alternative to neoliberalism today reveals a remarkable stagnation of both thought and ambition. The first and most obvious problem with an attempt to use Keynesian social democracy as a core political narrative is that the story is more than 80 years old. Political stories need to be renewed. If politics does not feel fresh, it struggles to kindle the imaginative excitement from which hope arises. The second problem is that the surviving enthusiasm for Keynes among mainstream parties is highly selective. It has been reduced in most cases to lowering interest rates when economies are sluggish and engaging in tepid counter-cyclical public spending, which means injecting public money into the economy when unemployment is high or recession threatens. Other Keynesian measures, such as raising taxes when an economy grows quickly to dampen the boom-bust cycle, the fixed exchange rate system, capital controls, and a self-balancing global banking system, an international clearing union, all of which Keynes saw as essential complements to these policies, have been discarded and forgotten. Not only does this ensure that the rich old story has been reduced to 2 thin chapters, whose loss of context destroys their narrative power, but the absence of other Keynesian measures, as well as changed global circumstances, weakens the effectiveness of the remaining elements of policy. Let me give you an example. In 2009, in the hope of boosting the economy in the wake of the financial crash, the British government spent £300 million on stimulating sales of new cars. Under its scrappage scheme, if car owners traded in their old vehicles for new ones, the government, with the help of manufacturers, knocked £2,000 off the price. This lavish program was partly justified as an environmental measure, though it was clear from the outset that it would lead to a rise in environmental impacts as the materials and energies used in manufacturing new cars outweigh any likely savings from better fuel economy. Its primary purpose was to boost British car assembly plants and protect the jobs of their workers. But European state aid rules forbade such schemes from discriminating between cars made in Britain and cars made abroad. British car parts assembled only some 15% of the vehicles sold in that country, which meant that 85% of the benefit went to car plants in Germany, Japan, and other manufacturing nations. We could see this spending as foreign aid to some of the world's richest nations. The current pattern of globalization, which developed partly as a result of abandoning the fixed exchange rates and capital controls that Keynes advocated, ensures that this problem is to some extent repeated wherever Keynesian stimulus spending is applied. It might lead to a general, if scarcely detectable, global economic uplift, but the domestic impact will necessarily be weaker than Keynes intended. This issue is compounded by the phenomena of job-free growth, caused in part by the automation now spreading into almost every economic sector. Today, governments pull the starter cord, spending public money and cutting interest rates, that ignited the economy and employment in the past, only to discover that it snaps before the motor fires. 2 feeble measures, removed from the rich framework of thought and narrative in which they were once embedded, have little chance of sustaining a political revival. Another issue is that the troubles that beset the Keynesian model in the 1970s have not disappeared. While the oil embargo of '73 was the immediate trigger for the lethal combination of high inflation and high unemployment, called stagflation back then, that Keynesian policies were almost powerless to counteract. Problems with the system had been mounting for years. Falling productivity and rising costs push inflation, wages and prices pursuing each other upwards, were already beginning to erode support for Keynesian economics. Most importantly, perhaps, the program had buckled in response to the political demands of capital. Strong financial regulations and controls on the movement of money began to weaken in the 1950s as governments started to liberalize financial markets. Richard Nixon's decision in '71 to suspend the convertibility of dollars into gold destroyed the system of fixed exchange rates on which much of the success of Keynes's policies depended. The capital controls introduced to prevent financiers and speculators from sucking money out of balanced Keynesian economies collapsed. Today, it's hard to find a mainstream politician in Europe or the Anglophone nations, including those who call themselves Keynesians, prepared to call for their reintroduction. We cannot hope that the strategies deployed by global finance that helped to destroy the efficacy of Keynes's measures in the 70s will be unlearned. If the soft Keynesianism proposed by opponents of neoliberalism is to amount to anything but tinkering, it has to confront a wider set of challenges than most of its advocates have yet been prepared to acknowledge. But perhaps the biggest problem residual Keynesianism confronts in the 21st century is that when it does work, it collides headfirst with the environmental crisis. The book, Out of the Wreckage by George Monbiot. Free Speech TV is supported by your contributions, and I strongly encourage you during the pledge drives, or even not during the pledge drives, to call Free Speech TV at 877-378-8669 and make a contribution, support Free Speech TV. But that said, our program, the Thom Hartmann Program, what you're watching right now, is sustained by commercial advertising, and we're on commercial stations around the country. We run ads, they pay us for that. And one of the ways that you can support our program is by going to thomhartmann.com, our website, and clicking on the advertisements on that page for our sponsors and buying their products, supporting their products, or letting them know that you care about their products and that you support our show. That's thomhartmann.com, and click on the advertising there to support our program. We really appreciate it. We really appreciate your supporting Free Speech TV by your ongoing, calling and supporting the fundraising drives, and we also would really appreciate if you go to thomhartmann.com.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. I'm super happy to have on the line with us Jack Bryan. Jack is the director and co-writer of a new documentary. It's called Active Measures, A Conspiracy Hiding in Plain Sight. The website is activemeasures.com, and you can, the Twitter handle is actmeasuresdoc. Jack, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's great to be here.
I'm very, very happy to have you with us. I saw you on Bill Maher, and it just blew my mind. First of all, the backstory here. Russia has been involving itself in our politics since back when it was the Soviet Union.
Absolutely. Since the 1930s, they've been trying to not only involve themselves in politics, but get agents of theirs in high-ranking places within the U.S. government. And they have continued at it for a long time, and they've redoubled their efforts recently, and social media has made it much, much easier on them. But the playbook itself goes back to, the 1930s, and you could argue before that even. Yeah.
Now, they would argue that we're doing the same thing. Are there any international standards or norms for this? Is this, and that other countries are constantly messing in each other's internal politics? What historically has been done about that kind of thing?
There's certainly international norms for espionage. For example, with the Chinese, we understand that they look at our stuff and they look at their stuff. We look at their stuff. There's some complications, though, for example, with them stealing intellectual property, which is sort of a new thing. It kind of falls outside of those norms. So that's a place where we are constantly dealing with these norms with the Chinese. But with the Russians, it's an entirely different game. Mm-hmm. They really don't acknowledge any norms. And certainly it is a good thing to remember that the U.S. absolutely was doing these things in the 70s and 80s. Our lack of access to social media obviously made it much more difficult for us to do it than the way that they do it now. And I think that we don't do it anymore, certainly not to the significance of the level the Russians are doing it, and in large part because our government is so spread out, and theirs is a power vertical.
We had Kathleen Hall Jamieson on the program last week. She wrote a book called Cyber War that just comes right out and asserts that had it not been for the Russian influence in the election, and at a variety of levels, and the level of the possibility of affecting electronic voting systems and registration systems is still extremely unknown, but just, at the level of dumping data into Facebook and things like that, that without Russian involvement, Donald Trump would not be president, period, full stop.
100%.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with this.
So you can point to Comey and other things, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that in an election that was decided by 75,000 votes, you could find 10 or 15 factors that were 100% decisive. The Russians were a major one.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just that they were putting things out there, is that they were synchronizing these things with the campaign. And so when people are seeing things on their Facebook feed and then only hearing one candidate saying those things, it creates the illusion that that candidate is the only person speaking the truth.
For example?
For example, just the easiest example is Hillary Clinton's a criminal. That there were other presidential candidates that were saying that outright. But when you have a lot of that being pushed on social media, when you have the candidate alluding to that, it connects in the viewer's mind. If you're seeing on your Facebook feed all day this information, it sticks or becomes a reasonable option at the very least. Whereas without that, if Donald Trump had been saying a lot of these things in a vacuum, if they weren't being mirrored on social media, they would have sounded just crazy to everybody.
Yeah.
But it was that mirroring effect that really made it so convincing to a large portion of the population.
I've been asking this question. I ask it of Kathleen and of my listeners. I've been asking this question for weeks, maybe a month or so now, since this has become more and more essentially irrefutable. What if we can conclude, and you have, and Kathleen Jamison has, and others have, that Donald Trump is president, Mike Pence is vice president. Many of the members of the House and Senate only hold their seats because of the coattails of those two. The two people being appointed to the Supreme Court, Gorsuch and now Kavanaugh, that all of this was the consequence of Russian interference in our election. If we assume that that's true, what do we do with that?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I think that listen, from my point of view, all of this is going to come out. All of the repercussions of this are the most likely things that's going to happen. So I think it's a really good question because I think we have to look at this with seriousness. It is not a positive thing, just generally speaking, for a country for their president to go to prison. But if that's one option, and the other option is that China, India, and Russia are going to say, well, now we can't afford to not involve ourselves in every American presidential election, then that option is the best option you have. So I think the most likely scenario is this has to be dealt with really seriously in a really legal way, because otherwise it's open season. And I also think we have to acknowledge that that's not a good thing. This is not what we want as a nation, is to be, having our leaders be charged with crimes. But in a rule of law nation, you have to do those things.
Or having our leaders picked by other countries' governments. We have
even worse.
And there's different levels of this. I mean, in the Citizens United dissent, Justice John Paul Stevens pointed out that under the logic of Citizens United, Tokyo Rose would have been afforded First Amendment protection to broadcast directly into the United States, her propaganda during World War II. There's, like, if you look at the spectrum of foreign governments trying to influence U.S. elections, you had, Saudi Arabia and Saudi Aramco, largely through the business community, influencing American politics and decisions for decades. You have Israel, principally through AIPAC, influencing politics on a regular basis in the United States, supporting candidates and things like that. I'm sure that the list of countries that explicitly, overtly, we all know about influence our elections is, it's got to run to 10 to 15 countries. What can we learn? If we don't have you're talking about sending Trump to jail. I think that's pretty unlikely, but who knows? But, if that or impeachment are the solutions to this, which just gets us Pence, although maybe we could impeach both. Is there some call to action that is like, okay, let's pass laws, or Stevens pointing out that Citizens United just ripped open this door for any foreign country to come in and do whatever they want in the United States legally. Is there any way? And to the best of your knowledge, are there any attempts by legislators to change our laws?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think that there's really two approaches that you could have to that, And you can't really just address Citizens United directly, because what Citizens United does is it upholds the 76 Supreme Court case Buckley-Vallejo. So you'd have to actually go further back and overturn Buckley-Vallejo.
Oh, and I'd be at the top of the list for that. That was Lewis Powell's thing. That was the first step in the Powell memo.
100%. So I'm all for that. I think there's an easier way, though. And I think that there's a way that you don't have to go to the Constitution. And this is just sort of a personal idea of mine. I've not heard anybody suggest this, but that you tax political spending at a 99% rate and do it as a sales tax so that it gets passed on to the person spending it. And you would drive massive, or you could say any contribution over $5,000. Because one thing that's not ever questioned is the government's ability to tax. I mean, the entire purpose of the Philadelphia Convention was so that they could levy taxes.
Right. Well, wouldn't a starting point be to just end the deductibility of political contributions, or are they not deductible? I've never tried to.
I don't know, but I think that if they, first I don't think they are. But if they were, you would do some amount to curb it. But you could tax it at the highest rate you want to.
Sure.
And at that point, if you want to tax something at 99%, you can get rid of it.
That's a fascinating idea. A comment that I believe I heard you make on Bill Maher's show was about Trump and Putin sitting down when they met in Helsinki. Basically, that this was a second Yalta, the meeting between Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill, where they carved up the world. I mean, particularly North Africa and the Middle East. Can you riff on that for a minute?
Well, I think that one of the difference there is that I think that when Roosevelt and Stalin met in Yalta, I think that there was a little bit more of as equals. But one of the interesting things is that Stalin was, unbeknownst to Roosevelt during that conference, bugging him. And so I think that is perhaps an analogy. I don't know if I would necessarily compare it to Yalta, because I think that my strong suspicion is that at this point, Putin has so much over Trump that there's not an evenly held hand in any capacity.
Yeah.
That the sort of the seeds of the Cold War were kind of percolating under the surface within Yalta in a way that I don't think that Trump can afford to push.
Yeah.
And also there was, but so I think at this point that Trump is especially, once he won, he became even more compromised.
Right.
Because the real leverage that Putin has now is his knowledge of Trump's involvement in 2016.
Right, and we have about a minute and a half here until we're going to hit a hard break. My apologies, but we're talking with Jack Bryan. Active Measures is the movie. There are two kind of competing narratives about that. One is that Trump has been basically a Russian asset, that he's being blackmailed essentially or owned, and the other is that Trump is just a businessman eager to build a Trump Tower in Moscow, and that's why he's trying to keep this relationship open. What are your thoughts? What does your research tell you?
I think those are not mutually exclusive. I mean, our research is that this goes back to the 80s, and like any relationship, it develops slowly and for very practical reasons over time. I think that this is more a relationship that began as sort of this is a sketchy guy who is comfortable laundering our money in the 80s. Then throughout the 90s and 2000s, a guy whose business was falling apart and he needed the Russians. And then it became, after 10 years of that, just a relationship that was mutually serving. And so I don't think anybody came in a room and said, "Hey, we're going to blackmail you now." I think that they allowed him to know that their good friends were going to sit on this information so long as he was a good friend, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I think it was an all of the above approach. I don't think that you need one of these threads. And frankly, there's evidence for all of these. So I think that the evidence shows, and it would make sense that this was all of the above as opposed to just one thread.
Is there another? I mentioned two scenarios. Is there a third or a fourth?
Yeah, I think the third and the most likely, I think, is that the Russian mafia, which is a branch of the Russian government, has had a huge position within the Trump organization since at least 2004. And that that they're the reason that he got out of debt. They're the reason he has a business. We sort of detail this throughout the film. And I think that knowing that is important, and knowing the backstory of how far back this goes is important, because when the film comes out, or when the film is out, it's actually on iTunes. But when the Mueller reports come out, people need a context for understanding it, and that was the real reason we did the film. Yeah, fascinating. The movie is Active Measures, the documentary, A Conspiracy Hiding in Plain Sight. ActiveMeasures.com is the website. Jack Bryan is the director and co-writer. Thank you, Jack. Thank you so much.
Great talking with you. We'll be back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this. What should we do if our president is our president because of a foreign government? And welcome back. Oh, my. Let's see here. Shane in Seattle. Hey, Shane, what's on your mind today? Thanks for listening to KBCS.
Oh, hi. My name's actually Jane with a J.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Jane.
Oh, that's okay. I want to know what happened to the conversation about Kavanaugh's debt. I feel like it just disappeared, and it was sort of a loosey-goosey answer about it. Maybe, did that turn out to be factual or true, or...
I think
it just feels strange.
Yeah, my recollection is that I think it was Sheldon Whitehouse, I could be wrong, asked him about that credit card debt. And he said that him and a bunch of friends got together periodically to do events. And one of them was a game, and he bought the tickets, and then everybody reimbursed him, and he paid the back off. That's my recollection. I could be wrong, but I think that satisfied the senator who asked the question.
Yeah, I guess it did. I don't know. I guess it didn't satisfy me.
Yeah. No, I'm still wondering too. I mean, $200,000 in credit card debt. I couldn't even put $200,000 on my credit card. I think most of us have a credit limit of $20,000, $30,000 at the very most. And in fact, the only card I know of that has quote no limit is the American Express card. But if they see you jacking it up, they'll cut you off anyway. I mean, it's so.
And I feel like the allegations against him are incredibly important and worthy of the time they've gotten. But as soon as they came up, that conversation was gone. And anyway, I just wondered if I'd missed something, if you had some insight on that.
Yeah. No, you didn't.
Okay. That's all. But thank you for your show.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank
Bye.
you. It's great talking with you.
Okay, bye.
There we go. Thank you very much. And who's on line 10? Luke Vargas is going to do the news at the end of this break. Oh, great. Okay. So Luke Vargas will be with us in just a few minutes. And there is one other, we were just talking with, thank you, Sean. Sure. We were just talking with Jack Bryan, the director of this movie about Trump's ties to Russia. And here, this article now, this is in investigaterussia.org. Looks like this, according to this article, the intellectualist left-leaning news aggregator points out that Senator Lindsey Graham has received at least $800,000 in campaign donations from a man with ties to Putin-allied oligarchs, which could explain why the senator has been increasingly supportive of President Trump lately. This is Len Blavatnik, is one of the largest donors to Republican political action committees in the 2015-16 election cycle, and apparently started after Trump got his nomination. And they say in 2015-16, prior to this, he hadn't given much money. All of a sudden, everything changed. Blavatnik said, this is actually Richard Engel did a special report on this for MSNBC Sunday night, I believe it was. Blavatnik's political contributions soared, made a hard right turn as he pumped $6.35 million into Republican political action committees, with millions of dollars going to top Republican leaders, including Senator Mitch McConnell, Marco Rubio, and Lindsey Graham. Blavatnik contributed $800,000 to the Security and Strength PAC associated with Senator Lindsey Graham via Access Industries. This is like pretty strange stuff. Anyhow, we'll be back with Luke Vargas with Talk Media News in just a moment. Stick around. Free Speech TV is supported by your contributions, and I strongly encourage you during the pledge drives, or even not during the pledge drives, to call Free Speech TV at 877-378-8669 and make a contribution, support Free Speech TV. But that said, our program, the Thom Hartmann Program, what you're watching right now, is sustained by commercial advertising, and we're on commercial stations around the country. We run ads. They pay us for that. And one of the ways that you can support our program is by going to thomhartmann.com TomHartman.com, our website, and clicking on the advertisements on that page for our sponsors and buying their products, supporting their products, or letting them know that you care about their products and that you support our show. That's TomHartman.com, and click on the advertising there to support our program. We really appreciate it. We really appreciate your supporting Free Speech TV by your ongoing, calling and supporting the fundraising drives, and we also would really appreciate if you go to TomHartman.com.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Cast. Welcome back. Let's check in with Talk Media News and find out what's going on in the world today. This report brought to you by goatsfortheoldgoat.com and Loving What You Do. Alan Ratner's new book. On the line with us is the chief foreign correspondent for Talk Media News, Luke Vargas. You can follow him on Twitter at The Courier. Luke, Pew has just released their 2018 Global Attitude Survey. What do people around the world think of us?
Well, the headline that's getting, or the takeaway that's getting a lot of headlines is that President Trump is admired by fewer folks than Xi Jinping of China or Vladimir Putin of Russia. And I called up one of the lead researchers of this study to make sure that this is kind of the interpretation he's comfortable with. And he said, that's not untrue, but there's a little more to it. Yes, Trump is the least admired of 7 world leaders that folks in 25 countries were asked about. But all of those 3 men, Xi Jinping, Putin, and Trump, are net negatives. They're not looked upon favorably by citizens overseas. It's just that Trump is known more, that, unlike Xi Jinping, how much does someone in Kenya or Nigeria or Brazil, what exposure do they have to Vladimir Putin or to Xi Jinping to form the basis of an opinion, whereas Trump everybody knows about, and those who hate him seem to hate him. Where I think this gets a lot more interesting and where most of the headlines have not been concentrating, and this sort of ties in with what I was observing with President Trump's sort of zero-sum approach to diplomacy articulated in that UN General Assembly speech last week, in which he basically said, either you are going to be America's friend or you're not going to get any foreign aid, is that there's been a major decline, even over the last year, but especially over the last decade, in the number of folks around the world who believe that the U.S. cares about the inputs of their countries and the interests of their countries when the U.S. makes decisions. It really is the statistical embodiment of the America First strategy that, people are realizing that just the consultative process by which the U.S. would, check in to see whether U.S. policy links up with any sort of broader, aims overseas, that's just eroding very quickly. Where I'm getting a little bit of, inspiration, I suppose, from these numbers, and there's a lot to, I think, be quite depressed about. But one area is that, while most folks around the world in these 25 countries believe that China is the biggest rising power in the world, the country that has sort of gained the most international stature and power projection over the last decade, and those numbers far exceed the United States.
Which is certainly true, by the way.
It is certainly true. But when asked, which system do you want your country to follow, virtually everyone says the United States. So that opportunity to win the war of ideas still exists. We just have to fight the war in the first place.
Yeah, and Trump has taken us out of it. Remarkable. You can follow Luke on Twitter at The Courier. Luke Vargas, thank you so much, Luke.
Thank you, Tom. Talk to you soon.
Yep, good talking with you today. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be back with your calls right after this break. Stick around. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Gar Alperovitz's book, What Then Must We Do? Gar is an economist, by the way, and this is from the introduction. I borrowed my title, What Then Must We Do, from Tolstoy and the profoundly disturbing 1886 book that he wrote once he began to dig below the surface of what was happening in late 19th century Russia, a time when the system was in decay, the aristocracy enjoyed extraordinary luxury, and the peasants endured lives of hunger and pain. As a person of privilege, he began to understand something deeper about his time in history. Tolstoy wrote, "I sit on a man's back, choking him and making him carry me, and yet assure myself and others that I am very sorry for him and wish to ease his lot by all means possible, except by getting off his back." Most of us do not literally sit on men's backs, making them carry us. We do, however, often uneasily look the other way, satisfying ourselves with modest changes that reassure us that all is well, while millions are in despair. We've done the best we can do, we might say, given the realities. Still, many sense, as did Tolstoy, that to actually do something serious would require us to confront much deeper problems than we are commonly willing to do. What then must we do is not shouted in the streets, but it is a question that more and more Americans, young and old, liberal, radical, and conservative, are quietly beginning to ask themselves in much more penetrating ways. So let us begin. My starting point is the obvious fact that despite its great wealth, the United States faces today enormous difficulties, with no easily discernible political answers that even begin to offer strategic handholds on a truly democratic future. Elections occur and major fiscal debates ensue, but many of the most pressing problems facing ordinary citizens are only marginally affected, and in many cases in ways that increase burdens, not reduce them. The issue is not simply that our situation is worrisome, however. It is that there are growing reasons to believe that we in fact face systemic problems, not simply political ones. Systemic problems in the fundamental, not the superficial sense. In the pages ahead, I will suggest that our nation's truly critical problems are built into the very structure of the economic and political system. They are not something passing in the night that will go away even when we elect forward-looking thinkers and actively pressure them to move in a different direction. I won't load you down with statistics at this point. A couple of obvious reminders, however. Not only has the economy been stagnating for a long time, but for the average person and the average family, things have been bad for a very long time. Real wages for 80% of Americans' workers, for example, have not gone up more than a trivial amount for the last 3 decades. At the same time, income for the top 1% has jumped from nearly 10% of all income to roughly 20% of all income. Put another way, virtually all of the gains of the entire economic system have gone to the tiny, tiny group at the top for at least 3 decades. Worth pausing to think about that one. What's going on when virtually all the gains for the entire economic system go to the top? I'm not interested here in criticizing those at the top. The question is, we can do that later, the question is, what is going on with the system when this kind of thing happens and continues to happen in an ongoing way, year after year, decade after decade? Another reminder, almost 50 million Americans live in officially defined poverty. The rate is higher, not lower, than in the late 1960s, another disturbing trend marker. Moreover, if we use the measuring standard common throughout the advanced world, which considers the poverty level to be half the median income level, the number would be just under 70 million, and the rate would be almost 23% of all Americans living in poverty. That is to say nothing of steady increases in global warming and an unemployment rate that, if properly measured, is stuck in the range of roughly 15%. At the most superficial level, Washington, as the saying goes, is broken. Give or take an occasional gain in selected areas, the political system is simply incapable of dealing with the deeper challenges. It focuses on deficits, not answers. Long trends that don't change are a clear signal that it's not simply the modern period of partisan bickering and congressional stalemate that is causing the problems. The trends are moving steadily downward. We're moving steadily downward long before the Tea Party and the recent partisan foolishness, long before the Citizens United Supreme Court decision allowed corporations to put big money directly into politics, and long before many events that have heralded as tipping points one kind or another. Nor are people stupid. More and more have a sense that something different is going on, both with the economy and more fundamentally with democracy itself. A few more bits of information just as reminders again of something that we're all beginning to see. A mid-2011 poll found that roughly 80% of Americans believe their congressional representatives to be, quote, more interested in serving the needs of special interest groups than the people they represent, end quote. Another poll found that almost 4 out of 5 believe a few rich people in corporations have far too much power. And only 37% of Americans, much more than a third of the population, have confidence in the most solemn and august of American institutions, the Supreme Court. I'm going to dig much, much deeper into all of this, of course, but for now, let's leave it at this. when critical long trends do not improve, when they steadily get worse year in and year out, it is clear that we face deeply rooted systemic problems, not simply political problems in the usual sense of the term. Moreover, as these polls suggest, people increasingly understand that something is really wrong. The question is, how do we deal with a systemic crisis, something built into the way the political economy works, rather than just a simple political or economic crisis? Garo Parvitz, what then must we do? All aboard. It's a once-in-a-lifetime luxury Alaskan cruise on the Regent Seven Seas Mariner, July 24th, 2019. For more information, Keen Luxury Travel, 800-856-1155. And did I mention we'll be getting active on board with special events with yours truly, me and Louise, as we visit Ketchikan, Juneau, Skagway, Sitka, Hubbard Glacier, and Anchorage.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Duck! Is that a boat coming? It's like yesterday, Louise texted me go, and I said fish. Okay, having Amazon trade, I wanted to share a couple of stories with you, and then I'll pick up your phone calls here in just a minute. Having a union, Amazon is apparently, which just announced today that they're raising their wages to $15 an hour as their minimum wage, which is a good thing. I mean, that they deserve credit for that. But the Amazon employees, and this is probably what ties us in, the Amazon employees have been working on trying to get a union in. And in response to that, specifically Whole Foods, which is now owned by Amazon. Whole Foods has been in the process of talking about a union for some time now. And once Amazon bought them, it really stepped up. And so now their managers, Whole Food store managers and department managers, are being coached in how to spot people who might be agitating for a union and people who might want a union or vote for a union or whatever. And they've got these videos that they're showing their employees. One of them says, having a union could make it hard to stay competitive. They don't share our values. Really? Unions don't share Amazon's values? I mean, you know, people having the ability to have a decent job and a decent wage and decent benefits that, you know, acknowledge you as a human being in the economy and acknowledge the idea that the economy is here for the people aren't here for the economy. I would hope that that's a value of Amazon. Apparently not, according to this. The narrator continues, the union severs the direct working relationship between associates and managers we value so highly. So, you know, one manager, I mean, what the union does is it provides, you know, strength in numbers, basically, to the employees. What the corporation does is it provides strength in numbers for the investors. All the investors come together and they form a union. It's called a corporation, and it acts in their interests. But one of the things that it does as it acts in their interest is it hires employees to generate product that generates profit that goes back to the owners. So this is a union whose goal is, you know, the corporation is a union whose goal is to extract wealth from its workers. A workers' union is a group that is a union whose goal is to help the workers share that wealth with the company. One training video segment includes teaching managers how to find, quote, warning signs of unionization efforts. This by Michael Cianato over in The Guardian. Warning signs of unionization efforts, which included any employees who stick around after the shift is ended. Warning shifts also included looking out for union words such as, get this, God forbid, living wage. One Whole Foods employee who recently attended one of the meetings told The Guardian, they told us how, as team leaders, we're expected to toe the company line and be anti-union. As team leaders, we've been told that we are expected to support the company's anti-union stance and that unions were good at the turn of the century but aren't necessary anymore because the government now has labor laws. Right. This is problematic, in my opinion. I've got stuff here on the CFPB, the Trump administration, and net neutrality in California, the NAFTA deal. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff here that we can get to. Let me pick up some of your phone calls first, though. Brad in Chicago. Hey, Brad, what's on your mind?
Yeah, thank you for taking my call, and it concerns this. When Brett Kavanaugh, and my friend told me even before, but when he was working for Ken Starr, and also for writing up those salacious questions, and then for the W. Bush administration vetting harsh interrogation procedures, he would have had to have filled out one of those, I think it's 127-page security clearance applications. And I think on there, I wonder if they would have asked him about his alcohol use. And are those some of the things that the Republicans are holding from the Democrats and all that information?
That's a good question. That's a good question. Yeah, they're withholding hundreds of thousands of pages of documents that virtually everything from the 3 years he worked in the Bush White House. And
but again, the Ken Starr administration, which was earlier, is there a potential he lied about his alcohol and possibly other drug use? On that form.
And, that he may have had a history of such sexual assault, which, if exposed, could put him in a position where he could be blackmailed. And
what about the alcohol use where he said,
both, yeah.
I don't have an alcohol abuse problem or something like that?
Well, he may be a high-functioning alcoholic who's in denial. That's a very, very, very common thing. A lot of alcoholics, I don't have an alcohol problem. I can quit whenever I want, but every single day they're drinking. And you say, okay, if you can quit whenever you want, quit for the next 3 days. And they're like, well, I got reasons why I'm not going to do that. And they really don't seek any kind of treatment or help or even try to quit drinking until it starts to impact their health, until they start to hit bottom or their job or whatever. I mean, it typically takes some external factor because they're not paying attention to their own experience. I think that may be Brett Kavanaugh. But, that's giving him the most charitable interpretation of everything that I'm seeing. That he's not acknowledging his own alcoholism.
Right, and the whole thing is that his denial, sir, is a self-serving way of conveniently, in his own mind, if no one else is, an out.
Yeah.
In that situation.
Yeah, I think that may be the case, and that would be, by the way, his way of avoiding perjury claim. If he ever filled out forms, for security clearances or other things, or in his previous 5 or 6 interviews with the FBI, suggesting that he actually did not have an alcohol problem. His defense would be, well, I really didn't think I had an alcohol problem. I guess I do, but, at the time, that kind of thing. But, Brad, this is the kind of stuff that we're just going to have to wait to come out. And if the Democrats take control of the House of Representatives in this election in November, they will be in a position to start subpoenaing this kind of stuff. And given that the Republicans right now are going to start in November, they're going to start hearings into Hillary Clinton's emails again, and she's been out of office for years, I would think that this would be, fair game. Brad, thanks for the call, and thanks for listening to WCPT. Sam in Canton, North Carolina, listening to Revolution Radio. Hey, Sam, what's up?
I would just like to point out that while Mr. Trump was speaking at the Westboro Arena in Wheeling, West Virginia on Saturday night, it has a seating capacity of 5,406. But Beto O'Rourke in Texas had a rally which featured Willie Nelson, drew a crowd of 50,000 people.
Whoa!
Yes.
Were they in a stadium?
No, it was outdoors.
Wow.
Now, I've been keeping up every time Trump has one of his little pep rallies, and they are little. I've been pulling up the arenas that he's spoken in. The biggest arena he has spoken in only held 12,000 people, and he's been saying that he's selling out 25,000-seat arenas. He's lying about all of that.
Sure.
He even spoke this past summer in a high school gymnasium in Columbia, South Carolina, seating capacity 3,000. So when you see all of this stuff about, Trump speaking in front of a huge audience, he's not.
Right. These are crowds that Bernie Sanders would have sneered at. Bernie was pulling 20, 30, 40,000 people at a pop.
These are crowds that any sitting president would have sneered at. They would have had to put him in a much larger stadium or arena.
That's interesting.
But Trump is having these little pep rallies that make him feel good,
Yeah.
and he's not making any definitive statements. And the one, I believe it was last week, he spoke when the music that was playing on the PA when he walked up to the podium was the Hallelujah chorus. This thing is so staged and so fake and so poorly done, it is laughable.
Yeah, except that the rubes keep buying it. And it may be that the numbers are small because the only people who are allowed to come into these things are people who have donated to the Trump campaign in the past, which is their way of demonstrating their undying loyalty. So, you know,
maybe they've got to fill out a questionnaire and say, will you cheer when somebody tells you to cheer?
Who knows? I mean, when he did his announcement, he was paying actors $50 an hour to stand there and cheer and applaud when he was talking about Mexican rapists. I mean, that's how he kicked the thing off. This was all a PR stunt. Michael Moore talks about this in his new movie, Fahrenheit 11/9. This was all a PR stunt to get a raise out of NBC. That's why he did it, because Gwen Stefani was being paid more than him, and he was PO'd about it. And it's bizarre.
It's all staged. He is paying people to go in there and start cheering.
Yeah. No, I believe that that's the case.
When you're in a crowd and people start cheering, like at a football game.
Right, it's contagious.
Yeah, people start cheering. So he is paying people to go in, and they are cued. They know the script. They know basically what he's going to say.
Oh, it's performance art. I mean, you know, this is Trump's life. His life is performance art, and then it's continuing. It's just so malicious and malevolent. Sam, thanks for the call. You know, it's thought-provoking. Chris in Ridgecrest, California. Hey, Chris, thanks for watching us on YouTube. What's up?
Hey, Tom. How you doing?
Good.
I'm calling because you mentioned the anti-union videos, and I was going to say I just got fired from Walmart a month ago with, of course, no backup, no way to have any, and that's the first thing they do when you get a job there. When you go in, even before your job training, they show you anti-union videos with this really sinister anti-union guy that's going to get you and take all your money. And even when I started 2 years ago, I was like, wow, this is the first thing they're showing me. And it immediately made me suspicious.
Wow.
But, yeah.
That's incredible. That's incredible.
It's like working in a cult.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole anti-union thing is bizarre, and what's particularly bizarre is that the Republicans have succeeded in getting working-class people who don't have unions to, instead of saying, gee, I'm getting screwed by my employer, I should have a union, instead they're saying, look at those union employees, that's terrible, I'm jealous of them. It's bizarre. I mean, they've actually flipped logic on its head. Chris, thanks for the call.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be back with more of your calls right after this. And welcome back. Ann in Minnesota, watching us on Free Speech TV. Hey, Ann, what's on your mind?
Yeah, well, I'm a registered independent, and I think I've just run a business for 56 years, and I'm pretty proud of the fact that I really do not throw arrows at people, and I happen to know Kavanaugh's family personally.
Really?
And there's never been a problem with alcoholism in his 30 years, so I'm really kind of feeling that fairness needs to be on all sides.
Okay.
And I know he does feed at these homeless shelters. I know that he's been a coach, and I know he has a reputation where alcoholism would not play a part of his function. So I think that's unfair. And I think whether you're a Republican, Democrat, assuming a man has an alcoholic problem, I think those comments were most unappealing to me, a mature businesswoman.
I think that I've never attended an AA meeting, but I've certainly read numerous books in which the characters are alcoholics who go to AA meetings, and I have friends who, in fact, I had a producer for years who was an active member of AA. And you go to an AA meeting and you're going to encounter people who are judges, doctors, lawyers, politicians. I mean, the whole spectrum of humanity is represented there. number one. And so somebody being upright and appearing upright and even being upright, you know, doing good things in the community, all these things, doesn't mean that they're not an alcoholic. Number two, when he starts, and he has been doing it apparently for years and years. If you look at his speech 2 years ago, where he was talking about how drunk he and his friends were.
I know the family.
Yeah, well, you know, I saw the speech, and I've read his writings, and he's constantly
speeches don't mean anything.
He's constantly, Ann, holding up the abuse of alcohol as a positive value, and that's something that people who are alcoholics tend to do.
Are you a psychologist, sir?
I'm actually a psychotherapist, or I was rostered by the state of Vermont for 4 years.
Well, that's what I say. So am I. I have 8 years of college in this area. I'm just saying I really think the politics of this is just totally inhumane.
Yeah.
Because I think the man deserves a fair trial. I don't care if he's from the moon.
Well, he's not on trial.
I think that's
there is no trial.
No, but I wish, you know what I wish? I wish we didn't have a two-party system, because I think we have right and left.
And I have a real quick question for you. Why was it that Neil Gorsuch, who is just as right-wing as Brett Kavanaugh, in fact, arguably more so, and who actually would have taken the seat that Mitch McConnell, some on the left would argue, stole by holding that seat open for a year. Ann, listen for a second. I want to ask you this question. Why was it that none of these kind of things were brought up about Neil Gorsuch?
The problem is the women that are coming out of the woodwork. The man wouldn't have been able to hold down a job.
Not a single one came out of the woodwork around Neil Gorsuch. Not one.
Oh my God. No.
If you think this is politically motivated, where was that 6 months ago?
No, really.
I'm serious.
One more question. Just as an independent, if we had Hillary as president, how do you think our country would be doing? Period.
I don't know.
Tell me how wonderful.
I really don't know. I really don't know. And we'll just have to leave it at that. We'll be back in just a second. Stick around. Susan Walsh is going to drop by. We're going to talk about a cruise that we're doing, and then I'll continue to pick up your phone calls. We'll be right back. Welcome back. 10 minutes before the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you. You have probably heard the promos on our show. We do them every day, every in the third hour of every show. I have been for weeks now about this cruise next July that Louise and I are going on. WCPT helped put this thing together, our Chicago affiliate, and we're pleased to be the I don't know what you call it, the entertainment. And we're looking forward to it. And on the line with us is Susan Walsh. She's the Executive Vice President of Sales at Keen Luxury Travel, the travel agency in Chicago that's putting this thing together for the radio station for WCPT. KeenLuxuryTravel.com is their website, Keene. And Keen Lux Travel is the Twitter handle. Susan, welcome to the program.
Tom, thank you for inviting me to your show.
Now, Louise and I looked at this and said, wow, this is going to be an Alaskan cruise like we've never taken before. We've been to Alaska. We've taken some of the day cruises and things, but, and we've done a lot of cruises. We used to own a travel agency. But this is really at the top of the market, a really remarkable cruise. Tell us about it.
I would agree with you. I mean, it is a luxury, all-inclusive cruise. Everything's included except the spa. You have free gratuities, you have unlimited Wi-Fi, you have free unlimited shore excursions, beverages, bottled water, lattes, wine, spirits, minibar in your suite. So it truly is all-inclusive. And with a very small number of guests, there's only 700 people. So that'll give your listeners an opportunity to visit on a daily basis with you and Louise.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it. And to get into places, the smaller ships can get into places that the bigger ships can't along the Alaskan coastline. I understand that if you have a child under 17, that they can come along for $9.99, not including airfare. It's super cheap.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And in fact, Tom, I've taken two of my sons on this trip, and they had a terrific time. So you're absolutely right. I do want to clarify that you do have to have 2 adults or 2 first paying passengers at the lead-in rate, and then the child is $9.99 only as a third guest.
Right. And if single people want to sign up and get paired up with somebody else who can share a cabin with them, do you guys at Keen Luxury Travel do that?
Unfortunately, we don't have an avenue to be able, I mean, we do have single guests, obviously, but we don't have an avenue for pairing. Maybe that's something that people, on your show might be able to get together with.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, we don't have that opportunity.
Okay. And, final thoughts, why somebody would want this to do this experience in next July?
Well, I mean, it's an incredible opportunity. Alaska's beautiful. You know that, having been there. And the fact to be on a small ship that's all-inclusive, you don't ever have to pull your wallet out. Everything's taken care of. All you have to do is pack your suitcase and show up. Yeah. And we are offering some good pricing on this. We have some shipboard credit and a 5% cashback offer that we send to you at the time of sailing. But I think the biggest benefit, obviously, is for your listeners to interact with you and your wife.
Yeah, and we're looking forward to that. Susan Walsh, the EVP of Sales at Keen Luxury Travel. Susan, thanks so much.
Can I mention one more thing, please,
Sure.
Tom? I would just encourage your listeners to go to your website, thomhartmann.com, and if they'll look on the right-hand side of your site, you have a very nice little box there that they can click on the box that says Learn More, and it'll give them all the specific details.
That's great.
And again, I think they'll have a wonderful time with you and your wife.
Thank you for mentioning that, Susan. I should have, and thank you very much. Great having you on with us. Thank you, Susan. Let's see, pick up some of your phone calls here. Michael in Glendale, California. Hey, Michael, what's up?
Hi, Tom. First of all, I want to preface what I say by telling you that I agree with almost everything you say. We totally agree on Kavanaugh and Trump, not a problem. However, with unions, you are 100% wrong. In the past 40 years, surveys have been taken throughout the United States, and it shows that any time, in 100% of cases, anytime a union goes in to a private corporation, production goes down and costs go up. 100%, not 99, 100%.
So you're saying 100% of the time when a union comes into a company, the ability of that company to exploit its workers by grinding their face into their work to the point that they're exhausted, it vanishes. And so the company suffers a slight reduction in productivity, but the workers are suddenly now in the middle class. That sounds like a pretty good deal to me, Michael. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. Belinda in Detroit. Hey, Belinda, what's up?
Hi, how you doing today, Tom?
Good. We've got less than a minute. Quick point, Belinda.
Okay, I want to make 2 points. Number one, as a social worker for 30 years, the woman who was sitting behind Kavanaugh was a woman that I have seen many, many times that was beaten down. And I don't necessarily mean physically, but that was the face.
Are you talking about his wife?
Yes.
Yeah, she did look like, oh my God, the truth is coming out. Belinda, I'm sorry we can't get to your second point. We're hitting the end of the show here, but call back, later in the week. It's great to hear from you. Thank you so much for the call, and thanks for listening to Sirius XM there in Detroit, Belinda. We'll be back tomorrow. The program continues, the country continues, and Donald Trump is continuing. We'll see where it all goes. Anyhow, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires you. So get out there, get active, tag, you're it. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a great afternoon, evening, whatever it may be for you.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.